Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable wherever you happen to be listening. Maybe you're in bed with the lights already low. Maybe you're on the couch after a long day. Maybe you have this playing through headphones while the rest of the house has gone quiet. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I always like seeing how far these stories travel. Tonight we're going to New York City, but not the New York of skyscraper observation decks, Broadway marquees or yellow taxis moving through Times Square. We're going to a much smaller place. So small, in fact, that calling it a park feels almost generous. A few benches, a traffic island, subway entrances, Broadway running past it. Amsterdam Avenue close by, cars moving on either side, apartment buildings overhead, coffee shops and cheap hotels nearby. And for a period in the middle of the 20th century, this little piece of Manhattan acquired a name that New Yorkers understood immediately: Needle Park. Officially, the location was associated with Sheridan Square and the area around Broadway and West 72nd Street on Manhattan's Upper West Side. The name was never some proud municipal designation printed on a bronze plaque. It was street language. By the mid-1950s, the area had become known as a gathering place for heroin users, dealers, prostitutes, hustlers, and people living close to the edge of ordinary city life. The American Film Institute's historical record for the Panic in Needle Park describes the place as little more than rows of wooden benches on the concrete islands around Broadway, 72nd Street, and Amsterdam Avenue, and notes that the nickname was already in use by the mid-1950s. That is the place we are spending time in tonight, and before we go any further, I want you to think about something simple. Is there a place near where you live that everybody knows by a name that does not appear on any map? Maybe it is a street corner, a parking lot, a particular bench near a station, a block that people warn you about, a building with an unofficial nickname. Cities create these places constantly. The government gives them one name, and the people who actually live there give them another. Sometimes the unofficial name lasts longer. Needle Park was one of those names. It sounds enormous when you hear it now. You might imagine several acres of trees, pathways, fountains, perhaps dark corners where dealers waited beneath branches. It was nothing like that. Sheridan Square itself was tiny. The wider area associated with Needle Park included the neighbouring public spaces around the Broadway and 72nd Street intersection, including Verdi Square just to the north. Later descriptions of the location regularly treated the two little squares and their surrounding streets as part of the same world. That small size is important, because it changes the way you should picture what happened here. There was nowhere to disappear. People sat almost directly beside the movement of ordinary Manhattan. Commuters came out of the subway, shoppers walked past, residents returned to apartment buildings, delivery trucks stopped nearby. Buses moved along Broadway. Children could pass with their parents. People heading downtown could cross through a space where another group of New Yorkers might be waiting for heroin only a few yards away. Two versions of the city occupied the same intersection. You did not need to travel into some hidden district to find Needle Park. You could encounter it on the way home. That was part of what made it disturbing to people at the time. Heroin addiction in New York was not new in the 1960s, but during that decade it became increasingly visible and increasingly associated with younger people. Congressional hearings held in New York in September 1962 were already examining what officials described as a severe narcotics problem in the city, with heroin receiving particular attention. Later research into New York's drug history identified the late 1960s and early 1970s as a major period of heroin use, especially among young men in parts of Manhattan. Needle Park became one of the places where that larger crisis could be seen in public. Not understood. Seen. Those are different things. A businessman coming out of the subway might see a young man asleep on a bench in the middle of the afternoon and think he understood what he was looking at. A police officer watching two men exchange something near a luncheonette might think he understood. A newspaper photographer could point a camera toward the benches and produce an image that thousands of readers would study over breakfast. But the actual machinery of the place was harder to see. Who was selling? Who was using? Who was both? Where did the heroin come from? How much did a person need every day? What happened when the supply suddenly disappeared? Where did the money come from? What happened when there was no money? Why did people keep returning to the same benches when police officers knew exactly where to find them? And perhaps the most difficult question, how did a public space on Manhattan's Upper West Side become so closely identified with heroin that the drug eventually replaced the official name in popular memory? Those are the questions behind this story. If this kind of history speaks to you, the history of ordinary streets, overlooked places, and people who rarely appear in the grand version of the past, you can subscribe and give the video a like. You do not have to interrupt what you're doing right now. Just keep listening. If something in the story stays with you, you can do it later. For now, imagine that we are standing near Broadway and 72nd Street sometime in the mid-1960s. Do not imagine the neighbourhood exactly as it looks today. The Upper West Side was complicated during these years. Magnificent apartment houses stood beside deteriorating buildings. Wealth and poverty could exist surprisingly close together. Some blocks were stable and prosperous. Others were dealing with crime, neglected housing, cheap residential hotels, and the social disruption produced by decades of urban change. And then there was the subway. The 72nd Street station made this intersection a natural point of movement. People could arrive from elsewhere in Manhattan, come above ground, conduct whatever business brought them there, and disappear back into the transit system. The same geography that made the intersection convenient for ordinary New Yorkers also made it useful to a street economy. That economy did not advertise itself. There was no sign saying heroin sold here. There did not need to be. People learned where to go. A newcomer might arrive knowing one person. That person knew another. Someone knew who had received a fresh supply. Someone else knew which dealer had been arrested. A man sitting quietly on a bench might be waiting for a seller. Another might be waiting for a buyer. Someone walking past twice in 10 minutes might not be lost at all. The relationships mattered as much as the location. Street heroin markets depended heavily on information. Researchers who later studied heroin selling in New York described buyers relying on regular dealers, reputation, street information, and recognizable sources to judge what they were purchasing. In Needle Park, information moved through a community that could look disorganized from the outside but operated according to its own practical knowledge. People knew who was reliable, they knew who had disappeared, they knew who had been arrested, they knew who had overdosed, they knew when the heroin was weak, and everybody paid attention when the supply tightened. That last situation gave Needle Park another word: panic. In the language surrounding heroin markets, a panic meant scarcity. Heroin became difficult to find. Prices could rise. People dependent on the drug became increasingly desperate to locate it. This is where the famous title The Panic in Needle Park came from. The film arrived in 1971, directed by Jerry Schatzberg and starring a young Al Pacino alongside Kitty Wynn. Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn wrote the screenplay based on James Mills's novel. But the story existed before Hollywood found it. Mills had first explored the world in a two-part photographic essay published in Life magazine in February and March of 1965, working with photographer Bill Epridge, and expanded the material into a book published the following year. That matters because the movie did not invent Needle Park. It preserved a version of something that was already there. When the film opens, it identifies Sherman Square, and then gives the location its other name, the name known among heroin users. The production was filmed around the real neighbourhood, and Schatzberg did something unusual with the soundtrack. There was no conventional musical score guiding the audience toward fear, pity, or excitement. Traffic, voices, footsteps, subway noise, and the ordinary sounds of New York were allowed to remain. That choice tells us something useful about the real place. Needle Park did not exist in dramatic silence. It existed inside regular city noise. Imagine sitting on one of those benches. A truck changes gears on Broadway. A taxi horn sounds. Someone opens the door of a luncheonette. A train is moving beneath the pavement. Two people are arguing somewhere nearby. A woman walks past carrying groceries. A police car crosses the intersection. A man next to you is sweating even though the weather is cool. Another man keeps looking toward the subway entrance. Someone says a name. Someone shakes his head. Nothing. They wait. A few minutes later, someone else arrives, and three people who appeared to be strangers suddenly begin moving together. To someone passing quickly, there may be nothing memorable about any of it. For the people involved, the entire day can depend on what happens next. This is one of the problems with remembering places like Needle Park only through photographs of addiction. A photograph stops movement. Addiction does not. The life surrounding heroin was repetitive and exhausting. Finding money, finding a seller, buying the drug, finding somewhere to use it, avoiding arrest, recovering from the immediate effects, beginning to worry about the next dose, looking for money again. The cycle reorganized time. A person who had once thought in terms of breakfast, work, lunch, evening and sleep could begin thinking in completely different units. How long since the last dose? How much money remains? Who has heroin? How far away are they? Can I reach them before withdrawal becomes worse? That routine helps explain why a fixed gathering point mattered. A place like Needle Park reduced uncertainty. You knew where other users would appear. You could learn who was selling. You could hear rumours about supply. You could locate people willing to buy stolen property or tell you where money might be made. You could meet someone who understood exactly why you were anxious without having to explain anything. This did not make the park safe, it made it useful. Those are not the same thing. The surrounding businesses became part of the environment as well. Contemporary descriptions and later film production records refer to cheap hotels, luncheonettes, prostitution, and drug activity around the square. These were not decorative details added to make the neighbourhood look rough. They were pieces of an urban system. A cheap hotel provided privacy. A luncheonette provided warmth, a telephone, a bathroom, coffee, and somewhere to sit. The subway provided mobility. Pawn shops and fences could turn possessions into cash. The benches provided a meeting point. The streets provided customers. Police knew this too. That created another rhythm in the area. Observation, arrest, release, return. Removing one dealer did not necessarily remove the market. Another person could take the place. Arresting users did not eliminate dependence. A person could spend time in custody and come back to the same neighbourhood afterward. New York was beginning to experiment with different approaches to addiction during these years. Methadone maintenance, which would become a major part of heroin treatment in the city, developed in New York during the early 1960s, and St. Luke's Hospital opened a methadone clinic in 1966. But treatment existed alongside aggressive policing, criminal penalties, social stigma, and a public that increasingly associated heroin with crime. Needle Park sat directly inside those arguments. Was addiction primarily a crime? Was it an illness? Was the addict a victim, a criminal, a patient, a threat? Could someone be all four depending on the hour? People in the 1960s argued about these questions with the same confidence people argue about drugs today, and the answers shaped what happened on the street. It is also worth remembering that the word junkie, common in newspapers, films, police language, and everyday conversation during this period, flattened very different lives into one category. The benches did not care about biography. A person might have grown up 10 blocks away. Another might have arrived in New York from another state. Someone might still have a family willing to help. Someone else might have exhausted every relationship they once depended on. One could be using occasionally. Another could be physically dependent. One might sell small quantities to support personal use. Another might survive through theft. Someone might be sleeping in a rented room. Someone might have nowhere dependable to sleep at all. From across Broadway, they could all become the same thing. people from Needle Park, and that label was powerful. Once a place becomes known for one problem, everything that happens there begins to be interpreted through that reputation. A man sleeping on a bench is an addict. Two people exchanging money must be buying drugs. A young woman standing beside a hotel entrance must be selling sex. A nervous teenager must be there to score. Sometimes those assumptions were correct. Sometimes they were not. But reputation changes the way a city sees a place. By the time James Mills brought national attention to Needle Park in 1965, Sherman Square was no longer simply an obscure traffic island on the Upper West Side. The name had become shorthand for an urban problem much larger than the patch of pavement itself. The later book and the 1971 film pushed that name even further into American culture. And there is something strange about that when you look at the location itself. It was tiny. New York has enormous parks. Central Park stretches for hundreds of acres only a short distance away. Riverside Park runs along the Hudson. Yet one of the most famous drug landscapes in the history of the city was a handful of benches squeezed between traffic lanes. That is almost difficult to believe until you understand that Needle Park was never really about acreage. It was about concentration, people, money, dependence, transportation, cheap rooms, street knowledge, police attention, and heroin, all compressed into a few blocks. The physical park did not create the drug crisis. Heroin addiction existed across New York, and later historical research would describe the city as experiencing a major heroin epidemic from the late 1960s into the mid-1970s. Needle Park became famous because it made part of that crisis visible in a place where respectable Manhattan could not completely avoid seeing it. You could walk around it. You could complain about it. You could demand more police. You could hurry your children past it. You could write newspaper stories about it. But it remained there. And people kept coming back. That is why I want to be careful with the phrase, New York lost a park to heroin. It makes the story sound as though everything was normal one day, and addicts suddenly arrived the next morning and captured the benches. Cities almost never change that neatly. Places decline through layers, housing changes, businesses change, populations move, institutions leave, new people arrive, old social networks weaken, police practices change. Transportation patterns change. Money moves somewhere else. Buildings are neglected. Street economies find useful locations. A place can be changing for years before someone finally notices that it has become something different. And Sherman Square had a history long before anyone called it Needle Park. The nearby Verdi Square had been acquired by the city in the 19th century, and eventually became associated with the Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi. In the early 20th century, the area could be linked with musicians rather than heroin users. Accounts of its history recall figures such as Enrico Caruso and Arturo Toscanini gathering around the square. Think about the distance between those two reputations. A place where musicians gathered, a place where heroin users gathered. Same intersection, different New York. That transformation is where the real story begins, because before we can understand how Needle Park became a destination for people trying to buy heroin, we have to understand what this corner of Manhattan had been before heroin became the thing everyone remembered. We have to go back to Broadway before the dealers, before the newspaper photographers, before police officers watch the benches, before young men emerge from the subway looking for someone who might have a bag to sell. Long before anyone called this Needle Park, people were already gathering here. They were simply gathering for very different reasons. They were gathering for very different reasons. Long before anyone stood around Broadway and West 72nd Street waiting for heroin, people came to this part of Manhattan because it was becoming one of the busiest residential crossroads on the West Side. The subway stopped here. Apartment houses were rising around it. Shops were opening. Musicians lived nearby. Families passed through on errands. Hotel guests came and went. Streetcars, automobiles, delivery wagons, pedestrians and subway passengers all competed for the same limited space. To understand how strange the later reputation of Needle Park really was, it helps to forget the needles for a while. Go back far enough and there is not even an Upper West Side in the way we understand that name today. In the 18th century, this part of Manhattan belonged to a broad rural district generally known as Bloomingdale. The Bloomingdale Road had been laid out as a provincial highway around 1708 and ran north through the western side of Manhattan. It was far narrower and rougher than the Broadway that would eventually replace much of it. Farms, estates, orchards, country houses, and undeveloped land occupied the surrounding countryside. Wealthy New Yorkers gradually established country properties along the road, far enough from the crowded lower city to enjoy space while still remaining connected to it. Around the area of present-day West 70th and 71st Streets, a small settlement became known as Harsonville, named for the Harson family, which owned property in the district. Historical accounts place Harsonville roughly in the 70s along the old Bloomingdale Road. By the early 19th century, it was one of several small settlements scattered along the road, along with Bloomingdale Village farther north and Manhattanville beyond that. If you could stand near present-day 72nd Street in that period, almost nothing about the landscape would tell you that one day this would be a famous Manhattan intersection. There were no subway stairs, no tall apartment hotels, no traffic lights, no pharmacies glowing late into the evening, no benches crowded with commuters, and certainly no one referring to the area as Needle Park. The most important feature was the road itself. Bloomingdale Road followed a route that did not obey the rigid rectangular street system later imposed across most of Manhattan. When the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 established the familiar grid of numbered streets and avenues, the older road survived because development had already formed around it. Parts of its route eventually became Broadway. That is why Broadway cuts diagonally through the Upper West Side instead of cooperating politely with the avenues beside it. And that diagonal matters enormously to our story. When a diagonal street crosses a rectangular grid, it creates leftover pieces of land. Small triangles, odd corners, traffic islands, places that are too small for buildings but large enough for a bench, a monument, a subway entrance, a few trees, or a group of people with nowhere else they particularly need to be. Sherman Square and Verdi Square exist largely because of that geometry. Sherman Square, south of West 72nd Street, began as land acquired by the city in 1849 during the widening of Bloomingdale Road. When West 70th Street was opened through the area in 1869, the parcel was reduced into the small traffic triangle that remained. In 1891, after the death of General William Tecumseh Sherman, the Board of Aldermen named the site for him. Sherman had spent the final years of his life in New York and lived near the square. Historical park records also indicate that the little space once held a water trough for horses, which was an entirely practical feature in a city still dependent on animal transportation. That is worth picturing for a moment. The place later associated with heroin needles once helped horses get a drink. Nothing about a city corner has a permanent meaning. Across West 72nd Street, the land that became Verdi Square followed its own course. The city acquired the site in 1887. A monument to the Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi was unveiled there in October 1906, with thousands attending a celebration connected to New York's Italian-American community. The park itself received the name Verdi Square in 1921. The monument was not subtle. Verdi stands above figures representing characters from his operas. For people who knew his work, this was not simply a statue of a dead European composer. Opera was major popular culture, and Italian immigrants could view Verdi as a source of national and cultural pride. The monument's unveiling drew more than 10,000 people, according to the historical marker documenting the site. Think about what that means for the reputation of this corner before drugs came to define it. Music mattered here. Opera mattered here. Public ceremony mattered here. In the early decades of the 20th century, accounts of Verdi Square describe musicians gathering around the area, with famous names such as tenor Enrico Caruso and conductor Arturo Toscanini associated with its social life. And there was a reason people connected to music might find themselves around 72nd Street. Look across Broadway in the early 1900s, and one of the most extraordinary buildings in the neighbourhood had just appeared, the Ansonia. Completed during the same period that the subway arrived, the Ansonia was an enormous apartment hotel at Broadway and West 73rd Street. It was designed on a scale that made clear what developers believed this neighbourhood could become. Hundreds of suites filled the building. Its elaborate Beaux-Arts exterior looked more like something transplanted from Paris than a practical New York residence. Architectural historians point to the combination of new subway access and rising land values around 72nd Street as a major reason so many large apartment buildings appeared nearby. The timing was almost perfect. On October 27th, 1904, New York opened its first subway line. The 72nd Street station became one of the important stops on the original interborough rapid transit system, and the station and its control house have since been recognised for their importance in transportation, architecture, engineering, and the development of the city. Imagine living downtown before that subway existed. Reaching the Upper West Side required more time and more effort. Elevated trains served parts of the West Side, and surface transportation existed, but the new underground railway changed the calculation completely. Suddenly, a person could live much farther uptown and still reach the commercial and employment centres farther south with relative efficiency. Real estate developers understood immediately what that meant. A subway station did not merely move passengers, it increased the value of the land around it, and the 72nd Street station was especially important because it was built as an express stop. Now stand outside the station sometime around 1910. You would already recognise the basic structure of the place. Broadway still cuts through the avenues. The traffic islands interrupt the roadway. The Ansonia rises nearby. The subway entrance sits in the middle of the intersection. Pedestrians cross from multiple directions. Stores occupy ground floors. Apartment houses stretch up the blocks. But what people are doing there is completely ordinary. A clerk comes home from work. A woman carrying packages waits to cross Broadway. A hotel employee walks toward the Ansonia. A musician stops to speak with someone he recognises. A delivery wagon moves slowly past. A child is pulled away from the curb by a parent. Someone buys a newspaper. Someone else disappears down the subway stairs. The important thing is not that this was some perfect, peaceful neighbourhood. It was not. The Upper West Side was always socially mixed in ways that simplified memories tend to erase. Elegant apartment buildings could stand close to cheaper housing. Affluent residents lived within walking distance of working-class families. Broadway had commercial activity, while different avenues developed different economic and residential characters. The neighbourhood that took shape between the 1880s and 1930s contained row houses, tenements, flats, apartment hotels, luxury apartment buildings, shops, churches, schools, theatres, and ordinary service businesses. The official Upper West Side Historic District research describes development during this period as a complicated mixture of residential building types rather than a single uniform landscape. West 72nd Street itself became increasingly commercial after the subway opened. Older residences were altered so that stores could occupy their lower floors. Stoops were removed. Buildings were extended toward the sidewalk. Apartment buildings and hotels appeared. By the 1920s, the blocks around Broadway were increasingly shaped by retail and service businesses responding to the enormous flow of people produced by the subway. That gives us something very important about the future Needle Park. People had been taught to gather at this intersection decades before heroin dominated it. The subway made it a meeting point. The shops gave people reasons to remain nearby. The hotels supplied temporary residence. The benches allowed people to sit. Broadway supplied constant pedestrian traffic. The little squares provided public space where no purchase was required. Nobody planned any of this with a drug market in mind. It was simply successful urban design and transportation geography. But the features that make a place convenient for ordinary public life can later make it convenient for activities a city does not want. For the moment, however, heroin was not the defining subject. During the 1920s, the neighbourhood around West 72nd Street was still building upward. Apartment hotels became especially common on the Upper West Side during the second and third decades of the century. Some offered residents a mixture of hotel services and apartment-style living. Along West 72nd Street, older row houses were demolished or altered while larger buildings and storefronts replaced the earlier residential pattern. A person arriving at 72nd and Broadway in the late 1920s would find a neighbourhood that had gone through an extraordinary transformation within one lifetime. Someone born there when Harsonville still existed could have watched roads become city streets, houses become apartment buildings, horses give way to automobiles, gaslight give way to electricity, and an underground railway appear beneath land that had once been semi-rural. Then the Depression arrived. Building activity slowed dramatically during the 1930s. The Upper West Side did not suddenly collapse, but its great period of speculative construction largely ended. Landlords began adapting existing buildings instead of constantly replacing them. Large apartments could be subdivided. Townhouses that had once housed individual families could become rooming houses. The physical neighbourhood remained impressive, but the economic life inside some of those buildings began to change. This is where our picture of the ordinary neighbourhood needs to become more complicated. The buildings did not necessarily look poor from the street. A stone entrance could still be handsome. A lobby could still have decorative plasterwork. The exterior of an apartment hotel could still suggest the prosperity of the 1920s. But what had been designed as a large apartment might now contain several smaller households. Servants' rooms could become rentals. A townhouse might take in lodgers. An apartment hotel created for middle-class or affluent residents could gradually serve people with much less money. This happened in neighbourhoods across New York as the economy, housing market and population changed. By the post-war years, single-room occupancy housing had become a major part of New York's low-cost housing system. Citywide, there were nearly 200,000 SRO rooms in the 1940s, and the Upper West Side became particularly associated with the social and political battles surrounding this type of housing. An SRO room could be perfectly respectable. A worker living alone did not necessarily require an entire apartment. An older person on a limited income might prefer a small room. A recently arrived New Yorker might need somewhere inexpensive while getting established. Actors, musicians, labourers, divorced people, widows, newcomers, and people simply unable to afford larger apartments all used forms of residential hotel and rooming house accommodation. But when buildings were poorly maintained, overcrowded or badly managed, conditions could deteriorate quickly, and that affected the streets outside. The Upper West Side by the 1940s and 1950s was increasingly a neighbourhood of contrasts. There were still expensive apartments. There were still professionals. There were families who had lived there for decades. There were writers, musicians, academics, immigrants, workers, and people attracted by rents that were more affordable than in wealthier parts of Manhattan. At the same time, certain buildings were deteriorating. Older housing was being subdivided. Some commercial blocks looked worn. New York's changing economy and population were reshaping the neighbourhood from the inside. The fact that this happened near some of the most impressive architecture in the city made the contrast more visible. You could stand near Broadway and 72nd Street and look toward a building designed for luxury, while someone living in a cramped rented room passed directly beneath it. That was the Upper West Side. Neither rich nor poor, neither elegant nor ruined. It could be all of those things within a few blocks. The two little squares reflected that mixture because they belonged to everybody. This is easy to overlook when we hear the word park. Verdi Square was never Central Park. Sherman Square was never Riverside Park. These were tiny urban pieces of land surrounded by streets. In 1952, photographer Angelo Rizzuto took a view looking south along Broadway from 73rd Street. The Library of Congress description identifies Verdi Square as the small triangular patch of green visible among the cars and buildings. That photograph is useful because it removes the mythology. You're looking at an ordinary Manhattan traffic island in an ordinary working city. People sat because there were benches. People met because the subway station was there. People waited because intersections are places where waiting makes sense. A person could tell someone, "Meet me at 72nd and Broadway," and there would be little confusion about what that meant. You came up from the subway, you looked around, you found the person. If they were late, you sat down. That function is almost embarrassingly simple, but it becomes important later. Drug markets do not always begin in abandoned places. Sometimes they begin in useful places. A seller wants customers to find him. A buyer wants to know where sellers gather. Both benefit from transportation. Both benefit from crowds. Both benefit from locations where standing around does not automatically look suspicious. A busy subway intersection provides all of that, but we are not there yet. In the early 1950s, a commuter seeing young men on the benches would not automatically assume heroin. A hotel guest walking through Greenwich Square would still see the monument. A neighbourhood resident could still treat Sheridan Square as nothing more than the little triangle near the station. The name Needle Park had not yet swallowed the official names, and I want to stay with that normality for another moment because later history makes it very difficult to recover. Imagine a weekday afternoon around 1950. The subway entrance is busy, cars move along Broadway, the Ansonia still dominates the corner. Stores along West 72nd Street sell ordinary things to ordinary people. A delivery driver unloads boxes. Someone stops at a newsstand. Another person waits beside the Verdi monument. An elderly resident occupies a bench because walking several blocks has tired him. Two teenagers are talking. A woman from one of the nearby apartment buildings is carrying groceries home. Perhaps a musician is heading somewhere for a rehearsal. Nothing about these people needs to be unusual. This is simply a neighbourhood intersection doing what neighbourhood intersections do. And then, gradually, the population on those benches begins to change. Not all at once. There is no date you can circle and say this morning the park was ordinary and by evening it belonged to heroin. That is not how it happened. Heroin had already existed in New York for decades. The city had long histories of opiate use, drug regulation, addiction, organised trafficking, and street-level narcotics markets. But after World War II, and especially into the 1950s and 1960s, heroin became increasingly visible in particular communities and public spaces. The Upper West Side had exactly the conditions that could make a small public square useful to a developing street market. A major subway station, constant foot traffic, cheap rooms nearby, restaurants and businesses where people could use telephones or wait indoors, a socially mixed population, buildings where privacy could sometimes be rented cheaply, and most importantly, public benches where people could find one another. The first changes would have been easy to ignore. A few familiar faces staying longer than usual, someone walking from bench to bench, a man who seemed to arrive every afternoon but never appeared to be waiting for a train, small exchanges, short conversations, people coming out of the subway, finding someone quickly and leaving again. The park did not suddenly become dangerous because someone used heroin there. What began to alter the place was repetition. The same buyers returning, the same sellers becoming known, information spreading. Word moving through networks of users that 72nd Street was a place where someone could be found. And once enough people knew where to go, the little traffic island that had spent decades serving commuters, musicians, shoppers, hotel residents, old men resting their feet, and people waiting for friends began serving another purpose at the same time. Most New Yorkers passing through would not have noticed the exact moment it started. They would notice only later, when the pattern had become difficult to miss, and by then heroin was already finding a permanent place on the benches. The people who began appearing more regularly around those benches in the 1950s were part of a much larger change taking place across New York City. Heroin did not arrive at Broadway and 72nd Street because one dealer discovered the park and decided it would make a good place to work. There was no single afternoon when the first packet was sold and the neighbourhood changed forever. By the time Sheridan Square acquired the nickname Needle Park in the middle of the 1950s, heroin had already become a serious problem in several parts of New York, and the trade that supplied it stretched thousands of miles beyond Manhattan. To understand why heroin became so visible here, it helps to understand what had happened to the drug in America after the Second World War. Heroin had existed in the United States for decades. It had first been marketed legally around the turn of the century, before its addictive potential was fully understood and before federal narcotics laws pushed it out of ordinary medical and commercial use. By the 1920s and 1930s, the people using illicit opiates were increasingly forced into an underground world. Doctors faced restrictions. Street markets became more important. Addiction became associated less with medicine and more with crime. During the Depression and the Second World War, illegal narcotics use did not disappear, but the problem seemed to many officials to be contained. Then, around 1948, heroin markets began expanding again in American cities. The National Research Council's History of American Drug Treatment describes a new wave of urban heroin epidemics beginning around that time and continuing through the 1950s and early 1960s. New York was one of the places where the change became most obvious, and the heroin reaching New York was not being produced anywhere near New York. A large part of the supply chain began with opium poppies grown legally in Turkey. Some of the opium moved outside legal channels and was converted into morphine base. That material travelled towards southern France, where clandestine laboratories around Marseille refined it into heroin. Corsican trafficking organisations became heavily involved in the business. According to the DEA Museum's history of what later became known as the French Connection, by the 1950s and 1960s, roughly 80% of the heroin consumed in the United States was being produced in southern France. Smugglers concealed it in luggage, ships, cargo, and specially modified automobiles before moving it across the Atlantic. That sounds very far removed from a wooden bench on Broadway. But eventually the international chain ended with somebody standing on a New York sidewalk. The shipment came into the country in bulk. It passed through wholesalers. It was divided and diluted. Smaller distributors received portions. Street sellers obtained smaller quantities still. At every stage the amount changed, the price changed, and the people involved became increasingly vulnerable to arrest. Eventually a user purchased what might fit inside a very small packet. Thousands of miles of trafficking reduced to something that could disappear into a pocket. New York occupied an unusually important position in this trade because it was both a major port and an enormous market. Heroin could enter through the city or pass through criminal networks operating there before being distributed elsewhere. It could also remain in New York, where the number of people using it was growing. One of the neighbourhoods hit particularly hard during the early post-war period was Harlem. Historical studies of New York drug use describe heroin use increasing among young people there during the 1950s. One later analysis found that use had begun growing among Harlem youths by about 1955, though the much larger citywide heroin wave would come during the following decade. Writers who lived through the period remembered the change very clearly. The important point is that heroin was no longer confined to the relatively small circles in which narcotics had circulated before the war. Younger people were becoming involved. Street markets were expanding. Neighbourhood knowledge spread quickly. A teenager did not need to understand international trafficking. He needed to know somebody who knew where heroin could be bought. That difference is important. Large criminal organisations moved the drug across oceans and borders, but heroin became part of neighbourhood life through personal connections. Someone had an older brother who used. Someone knew a musician who used. Someone had a friend who had tried it. Someone knew which block to visit. Someone knew which person on that block could make an introduction. One connection created another. And once several users began gathering in the same place, sellers had a reason to appear there too. The Upper West Side was close enough to other Manhattan drug markets for people and information to move easily between them. The subway made those distances even smaller. From 72nd Street, a person could travel north or south through Manhattan without needing a car. The station was an express stop. Large numbers of passengers came through every day. Someone arriving to buy heroin could blend into the same stream of people going to work, returning home, shopping, or meeting friends. This helped make the little public spaces around Broadway useful. There is an easy mistake to make when thinking about a place called Needle Park. We imagine that heroin users chose it because it was hidden. It was almost the opposite. The park worked because it was public. People could reach it. People could wait there. People could recognize one another. And sitting on a bench near a subway station was not automatically suspicious. If you stood alone in an alley for 40 minutes, someone might wonder what you were doing. If you sat on a park bench for 40 minutes, you were simply sitting on a park bench. That ordinary appearance mattered. A street drug market does not always require secrecy in the way we usually imagine secrecy. It does not require a locked room with guards at the door. Often it requires enough normal activity around it that illegal activity can hide among legitimate activity. Sheridan Square had plenty of that. Commuters were moving past constantly. There were nearby hotels. There were restaurants and luncheonettes. There were apartment buildings. There were stores. There were public telephones. There were subway entrances. And there were people who could remain outside without needing to explain why. By the middle of the 1950s, the area had developed enough of a reputation among users that the nickname Needle Park began circulating. The American Film Institute's historical notes on the later film The Panic in Needle Park placed the origin of the nickname in the mid-1950s and described the surrounding area as one of inexpensive hotels and luncheonettes where prostitution and the illegal drug trade were present. Notice how early that is. The famous film did not appear until 1971. James Mill's reporting that inspired the novel did not appear until 1965. Yet people were already calling the place Needle Park roughly a decade earlier, so before most Americans had ever heard the name, it already meant something to the people who used the area. And a nickname like that tells us that heroin had become visible enough to define the location. Not completely. Families still lived nearby. Commuters still used the subway. People still shopped. Residents still walked their dogs. The Verdi statue remained where it had been. Traffic still passed through. But another population had become part of the daily scene. You might see a man sitting for several hours without appearing to do much. Another person would approach him. They would speak briefly. Perhaps nothing happened. Perhaps one of them left. Perhaps both walked toward a nearby building. The details were easy to miss if you did not know what you were watching. The people who used heroin learned to recognize signs that meant little to everybody else. Who had arrived, who was waiting, who had money, who was selling, who was sick, who had been arrested recently, who might know where another seller could be found. It was a network based on memory and reputation. There was no phone application showing available sellers, no searchable inventory, no reliable product information. Much of the market depended on people. That also meant that supply problems were felt immediately. If police arrested an important distributor, the effects could travel down through smaller sellers. If a shipment failed to arrive, users might spend hours searching. If one source disappeared, everyone needed another. And for someone physically dependent on heroin, finding another source was not merely about wanting to feel good. Withdrawal could become the organizing problem of the day. The body had adapted to the drug. When heroin was unavailable, the person could become restless, anxious, nauseated, sweaty, uncomfortable, and increasingly focused on obtaining more. This is where the behavior that confused outsiders began to make more sense. Why would somebody spend an entire day walking from one street corner to another? Why sit on a bench for hours? Why borrow money from someone you had already borrowed from yesterday? Why sell something worth much more than the amount you received for it? Why take the subway across Manhattan because someone said a dealer might be standing somewhere else? Because dependents change priorities. The next dose moved ahead of things that had once mattered more: food, rent, work, appointments, family obligations, sleep. And once enough people in one neighbourhood were living according to that priority, the neighbourhood began changing around them. Small-time theft became connected to the drug economy. So did prostitution. So did the resale of stolen goods. So did short-term borrowing. So did people selling small amounts of heroin to finance their own use. That does not mean every person using heroin committed crimes beyond possessing the drug. They did not. But studies of people with severe heroin dependence repeatedly found that the need to finance frequent use could pull some users into property crime and other illegal activity. A later study of patients entering the methadone clinic at St. Luke's Hospital in New York found that arrest rates rose substantially after addiction began. The relationship between heroin and crime became one of the most important political issues surrounding the drug. And in the 1950s, the government's dominant answer was punishment. Federal narcotics policy had been moving towards stronger criminal penalties for years. In 1956, Congress passed the Narcotic Control Act, legislation designed to increase federal control of narcotics and marijuana. The law substantially strengthened penalties for certain narcotics offences and reflected the prevailing belief that harsh punishment could suppress trafficking and discourage use. The country was treating heroin primarily as a law enforcement problem that had consequences for the people sitting in Needle Park. Someone dependent on heroin could be sick, homeless, unemployed, and in need of medical care while also being subject to arrest. The categories overlapped. Police saw possession, doctors saw dependence, residents saw disorder, politicians saw crime, parents saw children disappearing into a drug they did not understand, and the person using heroin experienced all of those reactions at once. Treatment options were limited compared with what would come later. Methadone maintenance, which eventually became one of New York's major responses to heroin dependence, was not established until the 1960s. The pioneering work associated with Vincent Dole and Marie Niswander began in New York in the mid-1960s, after the heroin problem had already been growing for years. During much of the 1950s, there was no large treatment system waiting for somebody who wanted to stop. There were hospitals, there were federal narcotics facilities, there were detoxification efforts, there were psychiatric approaches, there were religious organizations and private programs, there were prisons and jails. But there was nothing approaching a simple, universally available path out of dependence, and even getting someone to admit they needed help could be difficult. Heroin carried enormous stigma. The public language surrounding addiction was often severe. Users were commonly discussed as criminals, degenerates, delinquents, or threats to respectable neighbourhoods. The racial politics surrounding narcotics made the discussion even harsher. By the 1950s, federal statistics and law enforcement attention increasingly associated narcotics arrests with Black and Hispanic urban communities, and public fears about heroin became tied to broader fears about race, juvenile crime, migration, and changing cities. Historical reviews of American narcotics policy show how strongly these ideas shaped the period. But Needle Park complicated the picture. The Upper West Side was not a single racial or economic community. It was mixed, and the people drawn into the heroin world around 72nd Street did not fit neatly into one category. That helped make the location especially unsettling to outsiders. Heroin was appearing beside expensive buildings. It was appearing near white middle-class residents as well as poorer residents. It was appearing among young people. It was visible in a part of Manhattan that could not easily be dismissed as somewhere far away. The drug was sitting on the same bench where someone's grandfather might have rested 10 years earlier. That proximity mattered. A resident could look down from an apartment window and see people gathering. A shopkeeper could recognize the same faces returning day after day. A waiter in a luncheonette could tell who was buying coffee and who was mainly waiting for somebody. Hotel employees could see people renting rooms for short periods. Police officers assigned to the neighbourhood could learn which individuals were regulars. There was no clear wall between ordinary neighbourhood life and the heroin economy. They occupied the same few blocks. That creates a different kind of tension than a completely hidden drug market. When illegal activity happens somewhere nobody sees, people can pretend it is not there. Needle Park did not give the Upper West Side that option. The benches were too visible, the subway brought too many people past them, and heroin dependence tends to leave signs. Someone who had been using for a long time might lose weight. Clothing might become neglected. Employment could become irregular. A person might disappear from family life and then return asking for money. Repeated injection could leave marks on the body. Overdoses happened. People became ill. Some died. There were also people whose heroin use was not immediately visible at all. They had apartments. They held jobs. They had relationships. They dressed normally. They could walk through the neighbourhood without anybody looking twice. This is important because Needle Park's reputation eventually created the illusion that heroin addiction had a particular appearance. It did not. The park showed only the people visible in the park. There were other users behind apartment doors, in hotel rooms, in bathrooms, in workplaces, and in neighbourhoods across New York. The benches became a public sample of a much larger problem. By the early 1960s, city officials could no longer treat heroin as a small issue affecting a limited number of people. In September 1962, a United States Senate subcommittee held hearings in New York specifically concerned with illegal narcotics traffic and its relationship to juvenile and young adult crime. The official summary described New York as facing a severe drug problem, with heroin receiving particular attention. Testimony came from officials, police, and a former addict. That hearing occurred only a few subway stops from Needle Park. The government was discussing heroin in formal rooms. Users were discussing heroin on benches. The language was different, but the subject was the same. Officials spoke about trafficking networks, criminal penalties, juvenile delinquency, enforcement, and rehabilitation. A person in withdrawal cared about who had a bag. A detective cared about who supplied the cellar. A neighbourhood resident cared about whether it was safe to walk through the square. A shopkeeper cared about theft. A parent cared about a son who had stopped coming home. Everyone was looking at heroin from a different direction, and the drug kept moving through the city regardless. By the early 1960s, New York was approaching the much larger heroin epidemic that would become unmistakable later in the decade. Research on Manhattan drug use patterns identifies the years from roughly 1965 through 1973 as the city's major heroin era, especially among inner-city youth. Among young men studied in Manhattan, initiation into heroin use rose sharply during those years before reaching its high point around 1970 to 1972. Needle Park therefore developed just before the worst of the wave. It already had a name, it already had sellers, it already had users, it already had a reputation. Then the number of people moving through New York's heroin economy increased. This is when the small size of Sheridan Square became important again. You did not need hundreds of people there to make the park look overwhelmed. 20 people could change the atmosphere, 30 could dominate the benches. A few recognisable dealers could make the location useful enough that buyers continued returning. Once buyers reliably appeared, sellers had more reason to stay. Once sellers reliably appeared, more buyers came. The system reinforced itself, and the neighbourhood businesses around it had to adapt. Some tolerated the activity because there was little they could do. Others called police. Some refused bathroom access. Some watched customers closely. Some became part of the informal economy themselves. Cheap rooms nearby became useful because heroin use required privacy that the benches could not provide. The park was where people met. The surrounding blocks were where the rest of life happened. Someone might arrange a purchase outside and use the drug somewhere else. Someone might meet a partner. Someone might hear about a room. Someone might find out who had been arrested. Someone might learn that a new batch of heroin had reached the neighbourhood. This is how a tiny public space became more than a place to sit. It became an information centre, and that is why police could never solve the problem simply by removing one person from one bench. The park was not one dealer. It was not one gang. It was not one group of addicts. It was a meeting point inside a much larger network. Remove one seller, and the customers still knew where to return. Arrest one user, and his friends remained. Clear the benches in the afternoon and people could come back in the evening. The subway kept running. The hotels remained. The sidewalks remained. The demand remained. And above everything else, the dependence remained. By the time the nickname Needle Park became established, the change in Sheridan Square was no longer something only heroin users understood. People living nearby were noticing, police were noticing, reporters would soon notice, and then photographers would arrive. Before the cameras came, however, the park had its own daily routine, and that routine is where the place becomes easier to understand. You have to spend a day around those benches, watch who arrives first, see how buyers locate sellers, notice where people disappear between transactions, and understand why someone might remain at Broadway and 72nd Street from morning until long after dark. Because by the 1960s, Needle Park was no longer simply a location where heroin happened to be sold. For some of the people who gathered there, it had become the centre of the day. For some of the people who gathered there, Needle Park had become the centre of the day. That sounds like an exaggeration until you understand what physical dependence did to a person's schedule. For someone heavily dependent on heroin, the ordinary structure of the day could begin to disappear. Morning did not necessarily mean breakfast. Afternoon did not necessarily mean work. Evening did not necessarily mean going home. Time became organised around a much more immediate set of questions. When did I last use? How long until I become sick? Where is the money coming from? Who has heroin today? Researchers studying New York heroin users would repeatedly find that obtaining drugs and obtaining the money needed to buy them could consume enormous portions of daily life. So imagine Broadway and 72nd Street on an ordinary morning in the middle of the 1960s. The city has already started moving. Subway passengers come up the stairs in groups. Buses stop and pull away. Store gates rise. Coffee is being poured in nearby luncheonettes. Delivery trucks block traffic while drivers carry boxes inside. Residents hurry past Sheridan Square with newspapers under their arms. And on the benches, a smaller group is beginning another kind of work. Waiting. Waiting is one of the details that gets lost when heroin addiction is shown quickly on television or in movies. We usually see the dramatic moments, the arrest, the overdose, the injection, the argument, the robbery. Real life contained much more waiting. Waiting for someone to arrive. Waiting for someone who knew someone else. Waiting while a seller went somewhere and promised to return. Waiting for money. Waiting for a person who owed money. Waiting to hear whether a shipment had reached the neighbourhood. Waiting in a luncheonette because it was cold outside. Waiting beside a telephone. Waiting on the same bench for so long that the people around you began to feel like co-workers in a job nobody had officially given you. James Mills and photographer Bill Epridge entered this world in 1965 while preparing a 2-part report for Life magazine. Their work followed 2 young heroin users, identified as John and Karen, closely enough to show American readers something most had never seen in detail, not simply drug use, but the repetitive daily life surrounding it. Epridge's photographs showed hotel rooms, streets, exhaustion, relationships, and the social world around addiction. Life later described the project as a portrait of 2 young people whose lives had become consumed by heroin. That distinction matters. Needle Park was not just a place where people injected heroin. It was a place where people knew one another. Some were close friends, some were lovers, some were relatives, some were customers, some were sellers, some were people you trusted only because you had no better choice. Some were people you did not trust at all, but you still needed information from them. The later novel James Mills developed from his reporting, and the film adapted from it, presented Needle Park as a recognisable social circle, where drug customers, small sellers, thieves, prostitutes, and other people living around the heroin economy repeatedly crossed paths. Although those works shaped characters into a narrative, they drew on Mills's months of first-hand observation in this environment. That meant walking into the square as a regular was different from walking into it as a stranger. A regular could scan the benches and immediately learn something. That person is here, so maybe there is heroin around. That person is missing, which might mean an arrest. Those two are talking, so perhaps they know something. Someone looks sick. Someone looks comfortable. Someone who normally sells is not selling. Someone who never seems to have money suddenly has money. Nobody needed to announce any of this. People watched. In an illegal market, information has value because there is no official system telling buyers what is available, who is trustworthy, or whether someone will return after taking their money. Later ethnographic research into New York heroin markets found that reputation, repeated relationships, recognizable sellers, and information shared among users were important parts of street purchasing. Needle Park provided a place where that information could circulate. You sat down. Someone joined you. You asked a question without making it sound too much like a question. Maybe nothing was available yet. Maybe someone had heard that heroin would arrive later. Maybe a seller was working a few blocks away. Maybe police had picked someone up. Maybe the person giving you the information was lying. That was another part of the routine. Nobody could simply telephone a legitimate business, ask whether heroin was in stock and receive a reliable answer. Rumour moved faster than certainty. A single sentence could send several people walking downtown. Another rumour could bring them back an hour later. The geography of addiction expanded and contracted according to whatever people believed at that moment. On a good day, from the user's perspective, the process might be relatively short. Money was available, a familiar seller appeared, a purchase happened, the person left. But addiction rarely arranged itself around good days. The first problem was usually money. Heroin had to be purchased again and again. Physical dependence meant that whatever amount had solved yesterday's problem did not solve today's. The need returned. For users without steady income, financing repeated purchases could become a daily crisis. New York studies examining heroin dependence and crime found that criminal activity often increased after addiction, especially among people whose legal income could not support regular drug use. That did not mean everyone in Needle Park was a thief. But theft was part of the economy surrounding the park. So was burglary, so was prostitution, so was selling heroin in small quantities, so was selling possessions, so was borrowing from relatives, so was borrowing from friends who already knew they probably would not see the money again. The film adaptation of Mills's work captured this relationship repeatedly. Characters steal property, pawn goods, burglarize apartments, sell sex, distribute heroin, and constantly negotiate with one another for money and drugs. Those details were part of the world Mills had observed before the story became a film. Consider what that does to an ordinary object. A radio is no longer a radio. It is money. A coat is money. A watch is money. A camera is money. Something taken from a store can become money. Something borrowed from a friend can become money. And money can become heroin. The entire city begins to look different when everything is measured according to what it might produce toward the next purchase. People around Needle Park sometimes use the word hustle for this broader struggle to get what was needed. James Mills's book is filled with the language of hustling, scoring, getting sick, waiting, selling, and trying to locate heroin, vocabulary that reflected the everyday concerns of the people he observed. Once money existed, there was still no guarantee heroin existed. That was when the benches became particularly important. Suppose you have enough money. You arrive expecting to find someone. The person is not there. You wait 10 minutes, then 20. You begin asking around. A man tells you the seller was there earlier. A woman says he's gone downtown. Someone else says he was arrested. Another person insists there is heroin nearby, but refuses to explain where unless you give him something. You do not know which story is true. Meanwhile, the discomfort you were hoping to prevent is getting worse. That pressure changed relationships. A person you disliked yesterday might become extremely important because today he knew where the heroin was. Someone you trusted could become unbearable if you believed he was hiding a supply. A romantic relationship could be pushed aside temporarily because both people were searching. Friendship and commerce mixed together until the boundary became difficult to see. The person who helped you today might expect help tomorrow. The person who shared heroin with you might later remind you of it. The person who introduced you to a seller might want a portion of the purchase. The person who claimed to be your friend might disappear with your money. Needle Park created community, but dependence made that community unstable, and there was another problem nobody could control very well: quality. Street heroin was not a standardized pharmaceutical product. The substance sold at street level had moved through several hands and could be diluted repeatedly before reaching the user. Buyers often had limited ability to know exactly what they were purchasing. New York researchers later documented the importance of seller reputation and recognizable packaging precisely because buyers in an illegal market needed some way to judge uncertain products. A weak supply created complaints. An unexpectedly strong supply could create something much worse. There was no laboratory report attached to a street purchase, no regulated dosage, no customer service desk, no legal mechanism for demanding a refund. If something went wrong, the person who bought it had little protection. That uncertainty was simply part of the market. It also meant that people talked constantly. Who has the good stuff? Who is selling weak heroin? Who cheated somebody? Who has a new connection? Who got sick? Who overdosed? Whose supply disappeared? The benches became a kind of unofficial bulletin board. And then there were the police. You could not spend long around a famous narcotics location without thinking about police. Detectives knew the area. Uniformed officers passed through. Users watched unfamiliar cars. Sellers watched unfamiliar faces. Anyone lingering too carefully could attract suspicion from both sides. The later film places narcotics officers directly inside this social environment, watching users and attempting to move upward from street-level arrest toward larger suppliers. That reflected a real problem for narcotics enforcement. Arresting individual users or low-level sellers didn't necessarily reveal the people supplying larger quantities, so everybody watched everybody. A person approaching the square might first look for a dealer, then look for police, then look again at the dealer. Someone suddenly walking away could mean heroin had arrived, or it could mean someone had spotted an officer. A police car turning onto Broadway could empty part of the benches without any officer needing to get out. Then, after a while, people returned. This repetitive movement gave Needle Park a daily rhythm that was obvious once you knew what you were watching. Gather, scatter, return, wait, walk away, come back. Someone gets arrested. Someone else takes his place. The subway keeps delivering people. The benches fill again. The sheer visibility of the park created an unusual contradiction. The people using it needed privacy for illegal activity, but they also needed each other. A completely hidden location would have made finding sellers difficult. A completely exposed location made arrest easier. Needle Park existed somewhere between those needs, in a public intersection busy enough to provide cover, but familiar enough that regulars could find one another. The American Film Institute's historical description emphasizes just how small and exposed the location really was. Wooden benches on concrete islands surrounded by Broadway, 72nd Street and Amsterdam Avenue. Bad weather did not eliminate the need. That is something worth remembering. A cold January morning could make standing around miserable. Rain soaked the benches. Summer heat made the pavement uncomfortable. People still came. Dependents did not check the weather forecast. Nearby luncheonettes became useful partly because they offered something the park could not. A roof, warmth, coffee, a chair, and a place where somebody could remain temporarily without being fully outside. Contemporary descriptions of the Needle Park area regularly mention those inexpensive luncheonettes and hotels as part of the neighbourhood environment. Imagine sitting over one cup of coffee for an hour because you're waiting for someone. The waiter knows why you are there. You know he knows. He would like you either to order something else or leave. You have almost no money left because the money is meant for heroin. You watch the door every time it opens. The person you need never appears. Eventually the waiter tells you that you cannot stay. So you go back outside. That could be half the afternoon. Hotel rooms nearby performed another function. They supplied privacy. People who had apartments could use there. People without stable housing might know someone with a room. Some rooms were occupied by several people coming and going. Mills and Epridge's 1965 reporting documented heroin users in inexpensive hotel environments, and the later fictionalized account repeatedly moves between the park, cheap rooms, restaurants, streets, and temporary apartments. The park was therefore only the visible portion of the world. What happened on the benches led somewhere else. A meeting led to a hotel. A rumour led to another neighbourhood. A purchase led to a bathroom or apartment. A shortage sent people back onto the street. Someone who had disappeared for several hours returned looking relaxed. Someone else returned furious because they had been cheated. Another person did not return because police had arrested them. Another person might not return because they had overdosed, and everyone eventually learned about it. This constant circulation produced relationships that could look surprisingly ordinary from the outside. People joked. People flirted. People argued about minor things. They borrowed cigarettes. They talked about family. They complained about the weather. They gossiped. They discussed people who were not there. They fell in love. They became jealous. They lied to one another. They occasionally helped one another. Addiction did not erase personality. That is one reason Bill Epridge's photographs were so unsettling when they appeared in life. The people shown were not presented as distant monsters. John and Karen looked young. They embraced. They rested together. They occupied rooms that looked cramped and real rather than theatrical. The magazine's readers were confronted with people whose lives were dominated by heroin, but who still looked recognisably human. That seems obvious now, but it challenged the way many Americans had been encouraged to think about narcotics users. The stereotype made addiction easier to keep at a distance. The addict was somebody else, a criminal, a dangerous stranger, someone morally different from ordinary people. Then a photograph showed a young couple lying on a hotel bed. Suddenly the distance became smaller. Needle Park itself had the same effect on the Upper West Side. It placed addiction directly beside ordinary life. A child could walk past a person in withdrawal. A businessman could sit near someone waiting for a dealer. An elderly neighbourhood resident might occupy one end of a bench while a heroin user occupied the other. The subway entrance belonged to everybody. There was no gate separating the respectable city from the addicted city. The border was sometimes the width of a bench. This also meant that not everybody sitting around Sherman Square was involved with drugs. A location's reputation can make us rewrite everyone inside it. Once people began calling the area Needle Park, an ordinary person sitting there could be interpreted through the name. But the square remained a functioning public space. People passed through for reasons having nothing to do with heroin. The tragedy was not that the entire place had literally been surrendered to addicts. It was that heroin activity became visible and persistent enough to dominate how the place was understood. By 1965, that reputation was strong enough for life to explain the distinction directly to national readers. Subway riders knew the intersection as Sherman Square. Drug users knew it as Needle Park. Contemporary references to Mills's February 1965 article preserve that contrast. And the word needle told readers exactly what they were supposed to understand. Injection had become the symbol. But the needle itself occupied only a few minutes of a much longer day. The rest was the search. That is the part I want you to keep in mind. Hours could be spent trying to create a moment that lasted a relatively short time. Find money. Find the right person. Wait. Walk. Ask. wait again, take the subway, come back, borrow, sell something, call someone, check the square, get told to return later, discover the person has gone, start again. When the supply was steady, the routine could function with a strange predictability. Users knew roughly where to go, sellers knew where customers would appear. Money moved, packets moved, people disappeared and returned. Then something changed. A dealer vanished, a shipment failed. Police pressure disrupted a supply line. The heroin that had seemed available yesterday became difficult to find today. This was when Needle Park stopped feeling merely restless and became frantic. The people there had a name for that condition, a panic. The term appears at the centre of James Mill's account and the later film. In the story, narcotics officers explain that a panic occurs when the supply of heroin on the street becomes scarce, creating desperation and pressure throughout the community. Mills built his work around observations of people struggling to obtain heroin during such a shortage. During a panic, information became even more valuable. Rumours multiplied. Someone had heroin in Harlem. Someone had heroin downtown. Someone was getting a shipment tonight. Someone could make an introduction. Someone was lying. Prices might change. Trust became thinner. People who had been sitting calmly began moving. A seller who normally attracted a few customers could suddenly attract everyone. And people already worried about withdrawal became more willing to take risks. The social structure of the park tightened because everybody was trying to solve the same problem. That is when betrayal could become useful. Police understood scarcity too. If someone had been arrested and knew where heroin could be found, the possibility of cooperation could become leverage. The film, based on Mills's work, made this part of the panic explicit. When supply becomes scarce, people become more willing to inform on one another in exchange for help from police. That made every relationship less secure. Was the person beside you simply waiting? Had they already spoken with detectives? Was somebody watching the seller? Did the seller suspect you? Had an arrest happened because someone talked? There was no way to know everything, and paranoia did not require imagination when arrest was a real possibility. The park that functioned partly because people exchanged information could become dangerous for exactly the same reason. Everybody knew something about somebody. The man who knew where you bought heroin might also know where you slept. The woman who knew your cellar might know who supplied him. A friend might know where stolen property was being taken. A lover might know where drugs were hidden. Knowledge connected the community. Knowledge could also destroy it. By the middle of the 1960s, those tensions were becoming more visible to outsiders because journalists and photographers had begun taking serious interest in heroin addiction. Mills and Epridge's 1965 Life series brought the intimate world of New York users into homes across the country, and Mills's 1966 book expanded the Needle Park setting further. But a camera changes a place. Once reporters arrive, people know they are being watched by more than police. Once photographs appear nationally, residents know strangers are seeing their neighbourhood. Once the name Needle Park enters magazines and books, the nickname no longer belongs only to the people who gather there. It becomes public property, a neighbourhood embarrassment, a political problem, a police problem, a story. And stories create pressure. People who had tolerated the benches began asking why they should tolerate them. People who had looked away began paying attention. Officials faced questions about why an openly known heroin market was operating beside a major subway station. Police faced demands to do something visible. The users kept arriving because their dependents had not disappeared simply because the rest of New York had finally started looking at them. So the same small square now had several groups watching it at once. Dealers watched customers. Customers watched dealers. Users watched police. Police watched users. Residents watched everyone. And soon reporters and filmmakers would watch as well. That attention would turn Needle Park from a neighbourhood drug scene into one of the best-known symbols of heroin in New York. But before the name reached movie theatres, The people on the benches would live through the part of this history that gave James Mills his title. The moments when the supply tightened, the park became nervous, and detectives discovered that desperation could make people talk. By the middle of the 1960s, a person who spent enough time around Sheridan Square began to recognise that Needle Park did not operate randomly. It looked disorderly, because there was no official schedule, no storefront, no posted opening time, and no single person controlling everything that happened there. But the people who returned day after day developed routines. Sellers learned when buyers tended to appear. Buyers learned which faces were useful to watch. Police learned which people were regulars. Nearby businesses learned who would buy something, who would sit for an hour over one cup of coffee, and who was probably waiting for somebody connected to heroin. The square was tiny, but a complicated system operated around it. Contemporary descriptions identify the park as little more than wooden benches on the concrete islands around Broadway, West 72nd Street and Amsterdam Avenue, surrounded by cheap hotels, luncheonettes, prostitution, and illegal drug activity. Morning did not begin the same way for everyone. A neighbourhood resident might come through the subway station shortly after 7, carrying a newspaper and thinking about work. A shopkeeper was opening a gate. A hotel employee was finishing a night shift. Someone dependent on heroin might already have been awake for hours. If that person still had heroin from the previous day, the morning could begin quietly. If not, the first concern might be finding money or locating a seller before withdrawal became more uncomfortable. That was one reason the park could become active surprisingly early. Heroin dependents did not wait for normal business hours. A person might arrive at Broadway and 72nd Street hoping that someone who sold the night before would return. If that person was not there, the next step was usually information. Who has something? Did you see him? When is he coming? Did anybody hear from him? Those questions could move through several people within minutes. One person might know nothing. Another might claim to know something. A third might offer to make the connection but expect compensation. The seller was rarely operating like the popular image of a drug kingpin. Street-level heroin distribution in New York involved layers, and the person handing over a small quantity to a user might be several steps removed from the people importing or distributing large quantities. Later studies of New York heroin markets documented distinctions among higher-level suppliers, distributors, street sellers, and users who sometimes sold small amounts themselves. That last group mattered in Needle Park. The line between customer and seller could be very thin. Someone might buy enough heroin to keep part for personal use and sell the rest. Another person might help a dealer locate customers in exchange for heroin. Someone might carry money from one person to another. Another might simply make introductions. A person who looked like a dealer in the afternoon might have spent the morning desperately trying to find a dealer for himself. This made the social relationships difficult for police to read from a distance. Two men talking on a bench might be friends. They might be arranging a purchase. One might owe the other money. One might be asking where a third person had gone, or one of them might already be cooperating with detectives. That possibility was always present. Narcotics policing depended heavily on information because detectives faced a basic problem. Arresting the person holding a small amount of heroin was easy, compared with identifying the chain above that person. A street user could be searched and arrested, but that did little to reveal where larger quantities were coming from. Police therefore tried to move upward, from user to seller, from seller to supplier, and ideally from supplier toward a wholesaler. Later law enforcement descriptions of narcotics investigations make clear how important undercover purchases and informants became, because those methods allowed investigators to enter markets that uniformed officers could not easily penetrate. Needle Park offered police one advantage. Everybody knew where to look. It also created a disadvantage. Everybody in the park knew that police knew where to look. Uniformed officers were easy to recognize. Their arrival could interrupt activity without producing much evidence. People could stop talking. A seller could walk away. Heroin could disappear into a pocket or be passed to another person. Someone who had been sitting casually could suddenly remember an appointment elsewhere. So narcotics detectives needed patience. They watched. The popular image of narcotics work usually involves a dramatic raid, but much of the job was observation. Who speaks to whom? Who arrives and immediately attracts people? Who receives money? Who disappears afterward? Does a person repeatedly enter the same building? Does someone appear to collect money without carrying heroin? Who seems important enough that other sellers defer to him? These small details could matter more than the obvious person standing beside a bench. The police character Hotchin, the Panic in Needle Park, is fictional, but the investigation shown around him reflects real techniques used against narcotics markets. He and his partner watch users, arrest people, pressure lower-level participants, attempt to turn suspects into informants, and try to use smaller offenders to reach larger suppliers. The film grew from James Mill's 1965 reporting and later novel, although its individual characters and events should not be treated as documentary records. The pressure usually began with leverage. Suppose police arrested a low-level seller. The detectives could process the case and let the courts handle it. Or they could ask questions. Who supplied you? Where do you meet him? When will you see him again? Can you arrange another purchase? Someone facing jail might suddenly become useful. This created one of the most unstable features of the heroin world. The same person could be a customer, seller, friend, suspect, and informant within a very short period of time. The people around Needle Park understood this. They might not know exactly who was cooperating, but they knew cooperation happened. That knowledge changed behaviour. If someone was arrested and returned unusually quickly, people might wonder why. If police seemed to know something they should not have known, suspicion followed. If a seller disappeared immediately after meeting a particular person, rumours could begin. The park depended on information, but too much information in the wrong hands was dangerous. James Mills made this part of the Needle Park world central to the idea of a panic. In the later film adaptation, Detective Hotch explains that when heroin becomes scarce, people begin informing on one another because everyone is under pressure and everyone needs something. That description belongs to the dramatized story, but it captures a real vulnerability of illegal drug markets. Scarcity increases the importance of connections, raises pressure on participants, and gives police more opportunities to use arrests and cooperation to reach other people. The strange thing was that all of this could happen while the intersection looked almost normal. At 10 in the morning, commuters were still passing. At noon, office workers might buy lunch nearby. Traffic continued on Broadway. The subway doors opened underground every few minutes. A person looking casually at the square might see 6 people sitting on benches and assume almost nothing was happening. But those 6 people could be waiting for a 7th. The 7th person arrived. He spoke to one man. The man got up. Another person followed. They walked away separately. 20 minutes later, 3 people returned. Suddenly, there was more movement. The important moments did not necessarily look important. That was one reason narcotics detectives had to understand patterns rather than individual gestures. A direct hand-to-hand exchange could produce an arrest, but a larger investigation required figuring out the structure behind it, and the structure could change constantly. One seller was arrested, another took over, someone found a new supplier, a customer began selling, a dealer moved operations into a building, someone started using a public telephone as part of the arrangement, another person used a nearby restaurant as a waiting area. The drug market adjusted to pressure because the demand had not gone away. New York officials understood by the early 1960s that enforcement alone was struggling to stop the heroin trade. Congressional hearings held in New York in September 1962 focused specifically on why illegal narcotics traffic continued to flourish despite arrests and penalties. The hearings included testimony from the mayor, the police commissioner, and a former addict, and described the city's drug problem as severe, with heroin receiving particular attention. The men selling on the street were therefore operating inside a much larger contest. Police were trying to interrupt supply. Dealers were trying to maintain it. Users were trying to find it. Residents wanted the visible activity removed. Politicians wanted arrests. And everyone measured success differently. A detective could make 10 arrests and consider the day productive. A neighbourhood resident could look at the same benches the following afternoon, see new people sitting there, and conclude that nothing had changed. Both could be correct. That contradiction became one of the permanent problems of street narcotics enforcement. Removing people was easier than removing the conditions that brought people together. Sheridan Square remained beside a major subway station. The hotels remained. The streets remained. The buyers remained. Most importantly, physical dependence remained. The market could therefore recover after police action. This happened at different speeds. Sometimes an arrest disrupted the park for a few hours. People became cautious. The benches thinned. Known sellers disappeared. Regular users started checking other locations. By evening, activity could begin returning. Sometimes the disruption lasted longer because an important supplier had been removed. That was when the park's rhythm changed noticeably. People walked more. There were more conversations. Someone who normally stayed in one place began checking several locations. Users left the square and returned repeatedly. Rumours spread. The same question passed from person to person. Anything around? The answer might be no. That was a panic. Not panic in the sense of people screaming and running through the street. It was a shortage. Heroin had become difficult to obtain. For someone who was not dependent, that might sound like good news. For someone who was dependent, it created immediate pressure. The person now had to search farther. A rumour about heroin 10 blocks away became worth investigating. A questionable seller became worth trusting. A person you disliked became worth talking to. Someone who had cheated you before might receive another chance because there were no alternatives. The entire social atmosphere could change when supply tightened, and detectives understood that shortages could expose relationships that were otherwise hidden. Someone desperate enough might make mistakes. Someone might approach a seller too openly. A lower-level dealer might search for a new supplier and inadvertently reveal a connection. A person under arrest might become more willing to cooperate if police could offer some form of consideration. The fictional Hotch uses exactly this pressure in the panic in Needle Park. He watches Helen, delays consequences, reminds her about pending charges, and ultimately tries to use her relationship with Bobby to reach a larger heroin shipment. Again, the characters are fictional, but the underlying police logic is recognisable. The best person to lead investigators into a closed drug network was often someone already accepted inside it. That kind of policing produced resentment even among people who were not dealers. From the police perspective, an informant could make an otherwise impossible case. From the street perspective, the same person was a betrayer. Both interpretations existed at once, and the people at Needle Park had another reason to be suspicious of narcotics enforcement. The New York Police Department itself was moving toward a major corruption crisis. The Knapp Commission, created at the end of the 1960s and reporting in the early 1970s, found police corruption to be widespread, though not uniform throughout the department. Its investigation examined corruption involving gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and other illegal businesses. It described officers who passively accepted routine payoffs, and a smaller number who actively sought larger opportunities for corruption. Narcotics enforcement was particularly vulnerable because drugs were portable, valuable, illegal, and usually exchanged in cash. A later New York State Commission of Investigation report devoted extensive attention to narcotics law enforcement in the city, including the NYPD Narcotics Division, its Special Investigations Unit, arrest practices, interagency problems, and patterns of police corruption. The report specifically criticised aspects of the narcotics enforcement system and examined cases involving officers accused of corrupt behaviour. That does not mean every detective watching Needle Park was corrupt. It would be inaccurate to suggest that. Many officers were doing exactly what they had been assigned to do, often in difficult and unpredictable circumstances. But corruption existed within the system, and people on the street knew enough about it that police authority could not always be viewed as simple or clean. There were stories of protection, stories of stolen narcotics, stories of payoffs, stories of officers looking the other way. Some were true, some were rumours. On the street, the distinction was not always easy to establish. This added another level to the daily calculations of dealers. You were not simply trying to avoid the police. You were trying to understand individual officers. Which detective had been watching? Which officer was aggressive? Who was new? Who had arrested somebody yesterday? Was a familiar detective around because he wanted an arrest, information, or something else? Street knowledge included police knowledge. The dealers watched the detectives almost as carefully as the detectives watched the dealers. By early afternoon, the square could become busier. More people had obtained money. Others had been searching since morning. Someone released from jail might return. Someone who had spent the morning stealing property might come back after converting it to cash. Others arrived simply because this was where their social circle gathered. The park was not only commerce. People talked about ordinary things, relationships, arguments, court dates, family, who had gone to jail, who had come out, who was sick, who owed money, who had disappeared. The life photographs made in 1965 by Bill Epridge are valuable, partly because they show that social dimension. Epridge spent roughly 2 months closely following young heroin users for James Mills's reporting, becoming so immersed in their world that Life later recalled narcotics detectives once mistook him for someone who had stolen his cameras and press credentials. That detail tells us how closely separate worlds overlapped around Needle Park. Reporter, addict, dealer, detective, resident, customer, thief, prostitute, hotel clerk, waiter. They could all pass within a few feet of each other. Everyone had a different reason for being there. As afternoon moved toward evening, the park could change again. People with jobs were returning home through the subway. Neighbourhood foot traffic increased. The drug market didn't stop because respectable New York had arrived. It simply shared the same space. Sellers might become more cautious as pedestrian traffic increased, or they might benefit from the additional crowd. A person receiving money could disappear among commuters. Someone crossing Broadway could make a handoff look like an ordinary greeting. The crowded station provided quick movement north or south if another location became necessary. An illegal market could hide inside the exact features that made the intersection useful to the rest of the city. Darkness added another change. The park did not suddenly become empty. Nearby hotels and restaurants became even more important. Someone might spend part of the evening inside a cheap room. Someone else remained outside because there was nowhere else to go. The same people who had been searching in daylight could still be searching after dark. And if a seller had finally obtained a supply, the news travelled. A park that had seemed anxious for 6 hours could suddenly become active. People appeared. Money that had been held all afternoon started moving. Someone who had been complaining about withdrawal disappeared for 20 minutes and returned changed. The entire mood could shift because one supply connection had begun working again. The dealer benefited from scarcity. Demand had accumulated. Customers were waiting. In later New York research, heroin prices were found to fluctuate with the supply conditions, purity and quantity, and researchers examined how changes in heroin prices could also influence revenue-raising crime. Nobody sitting in Needle Park needed an economic study to understand the basic principle. When heroin was difficult to find, heroin mattered more. A reliable seller became powerful. That power was temporary. Police could arrest him. A supplier could refuse to work with him. Customers could decide his heroin was weak. Someone could inform on him. He could become dependent himself and use too much of his own product. He could be robbed. He could simply disappear. Then the park reorganized around whoever came next. This is why thinking of Needle Park as territory, controlled by one permanent criminal organisation, is misleading. The supply above street level might involve organised trafficking, but the visible street scene was unstable. People moved in and out, roles changed, relationships broke, the benches remained. That stability of place combined with instability of people gave Needle Park its peculiar endurance. Police could recognise the location even when the faces changed. Users could return to the location even when their usual seller disappeared. Reporters could find the scene because the scene had a known address. By 1965, that final fact was beginning to change everything. James Mills and Bill Epridge did not have to discover some secret apartment known only to narcotics detectives. They could begin with a public place that already had a name. Their life report appeared in February and March of 1965 and brought the lives of New York heroin users into millions of American homes. Life later described the photographs as a disturbing early portrait of two young addicts, John and Karen, whose lives had become dominated by heroin. After that, Needle Park was not merely a place known to users, residents, and police. It was becoming a national image. A person in another state who had never walked down Broadway could see the hotel rooms, the exhausted faces, the needles, and the relationships surrounding the drug. The park was entering the media, and once that happened, the pressure on Sheridan Square changed again, because a local narcotics problem had acquired photographers, headlines, a best-selling story, and eventually a movie camera. The people on the benches were about to discover what happened when the rest of America learned their address. The people on the benches were about to discover what happened when the rest of America learned their address. In February 1965, millions of readers who had never been anywhere near Broadway and West 72nd Street opened Life magazine and encountered a version of New York that most tourist photographs avoided. The story did not focus on the Empire State Building, fashionable restaurants, Broadway theatres, or wealthy apartment houses. Life associate editor James Mills and photographer Bill Epridge had spent weeks following young heroin users through streets, cheap rooms, hospitals, and the small public space that users called Needle Park. The first instalment appeared on February 26th, followed by a second on March 5th. Their central subjects were a young couple identified as John and Karen. Epridge did not simply arrive for an afternoon, photograph a few people on benches and leave. He spent roughly 2 months close to the people he was documenting. Life later recalled that he and Mills had to persuade the young couple to let them enter a world where outsiders were usually treated with suspicion. The photographer became so familiar with the surroundings that, on one occasion, narcotics detectives reportedly thought he might be an addict who had stolen the expensive cameras and life credentials he was carrying. Mills had to explain who he was. That gives you some idea of how unusual the assignment was. Drug addiction had certainly appeared in newspapers before 1965. Americans knew heroin existed. Police departments announced arrests. Politicians warned about narcotics. Parents heard frightening stories about young people becoming addicted. But those stories were often presented from outside the addict's life. A police officer stood beside confiscated heroin. A judge announced a sentence. A government official quoted statistics. A newspaper described a raid. The user appeared briefly as the person being arrested. Mills and Epridge did something different. They stayed. Their photographs showed what happened between the events that normally made news. They showed the waiting, the rooms, the relationships, the exhaustion, the sickness, and the uncomfortable intimacy of people whose days had become organised around heroin. John and Karen did not appear as mysterious criminals from another world. They looked young, they had conversations, they touched one another, they argued, they became ill, they tried to find heroin, they watched other users overdose. Their lives contained affection and fear at the same time. Life later described the series as an early disturbing portrait of two people whose lives had been consumed by addiction. That was difficult for readers to dismiss. A police statistic can remain a number. A photograph of a person lying on a hotel bed is harder to keep at a distance. One of Epridge's images showed Karen attempting to help another user who had overdosed. Other photographs followed the couple through the daily environment surrounding their heroin use. The images did not need elaborate explanation because the physical details did much of the work. The rooms were cramped. The people looked tired. The equipment associated with injection was visible. Nothing resembled the glamorous rebellion sometimes attached to other kinds of drug use during the 1960s, and this was appearing in Life. That matters. Life was not a specialised medical journal. It was not an underground newspaper distributed only in Greenwich Village. It was a major national picture magazine. The photographs could be seen by families who had never met anyone they knew to be addicted to heroin. A reader in Ohio could suddenly see a Manhattan hotel room connected to the heroin economy. A reader in California could see young New Yorkers whose daily lives revolved around getting another dose. Someone living in a comfortable suburban home could look at the photographs and realise that the people shown were not characters invented for a crime movie. They existed, and they existed in the middle of New York City. The location helped make the story memorable. Needle Park was an extraordinary name for a journalist to have available. It explained the subject almost immediately. The official name Sheridan Square required background. Needle Park required almost none. A reader could hear those two words and understand that something had happened to the place. The nickname also made the problem feel geographically contained. Here is the park. Here are the addicts. Here is the problem. That was useful for storytelling, but it was also misleading. Heroin addiction was not limited to Sheridan Square. By the mid-1960s, New York was moving into a much larger period of heroin use. Later research identified roughly 1965 through 1973 as a distinct heroin era in the city, particularly among inner-city young people. One long-term analysis of young men in Manhattan found that initiation into heroin use increased sharply during the decade and reached particularly high levels around 1970 to 1972. Needle Park became famous partly because it gave this enormous problem a small location that people could understand. If somebody said New York had tens of thousands of people using heroin, the scale was difficult to imagine. If somebody showed you 6 people on a bench, you could imagine 6 people. If they showed you a hotel room, you could imagine the room. If they followed one couple, you could follow the couple. That is what good reporting often does. It reduces something enormous until an audience can see it, but there is always a risk. The small story can become more famous than the larger one. Soon, people who knew almost nothing about New York's drug economy would know the name Needle Park. James Mills continued developing the material after the Life assignment. In 1966, his novel The Panic in Needle Park was published. It grew from the world he'd observed while reporting the magazine series, turning the location and its social environment into a longer narrative. The fictional form allowed the story to follow relationships, addiction, street crime, dealing, police pressure, and betrayal in greater detail. Hollywood noticed. Film rights were purchased by Avco Embassy in 1967. They later passed to producer Dominic Dunn, who acquired them by 1969. His brother John Gregory Dunn and Joan Didion wrote the screenplay. This was before Didion became fixed in popular memory, primarily as one of the most recognizable American essayists of her generation. Here she was working with Dunn on a difficult film adaptation about heroin users on Manhattan's West Side. The film that eventually emerged was directed by Jerry Schatzberg. Production began in New York in October 1970 and continued into December. The filmmakers made an important decision. They stayed in New York. The movie was shot entirely in Manhattan and other New York locations rather than constructing a cleaned-up version of the neighborhood on a Hollywood soundstage. Production used the Needle Park area itself as well as Riverside Park, a prison, a hospital ward, the East Village, and the Staten Island Ferry. That gave the film something difficult to manufacture. Real streets, real traffic, real buildings, real subway entrances. The camera could look past the actors and capture Manhattan continuing to operate. Someone watching the finished film was not seeing a studio designer's idea of a deteriorating New York neighborhood. They were seeing New York in 1970. And Schatzberg pushed the realism further. The film has no conventional musical score. The soundtrack relies on traffic, voices, street noise, and other natural sounds. There is no dramatic music arriving to tell the audience that a character is in danger. No sentimental theme asks the viewer to feel sorry for someone. Cars pass, people speak, doors close, subway and street sounds remain part of the environment. That decision makes the film uncomfortable in a very specific way. Heroin use is not separated from normal city life. It happens while New York continues around it. That was exactly what residents around Sheridan Square had been experiencing for years. The production also made deliberate efforts to make the visible effects of injection look convincing. According to the film's production history, makeup artist Herman Buchman studied injection marks on hospital patients and people in morgues. The production used flexible collodion to reproduce track marks on actors. A registered nurse was present as a technical advisor during scenes in which characters appeared to inject themselves. The result was not polite. The audience saw preparation. They saw needles. They saw blood. They saw bodies that did not respond to heroin in a glamorous way. The drug did not transform the characters into exciting rebels. It narrowed their choices. That is one of the reasons The Panic in Needle Park still feels different from many films about drugs. Its main characters do not spend much time explaining themselves. They do not deliver speeches about why society failed them. They are usually too occupied with immediate problems: money, heroin, police, jealousy, withdrawal. Another purchase, another arrest, another attempt to find somewhere to sleep. The repetitive quality was part of the point. Al Pacino played Bobby, a young street dealer and heroin user. Today, seeing Pacino in a film carries decades of associations. You think of Michael Corleone, Frank Serpico, Sonny Wartzik, Tony Montana, and a long career of famous performances. In 1970, audiences did not have those associations. Pacino had appeared briefly in the 1969 film Me, Natalie, but The Panic in Needle Park became his first starring feature film role. 1 year later, The Godfather would make him internationally famous. Opposite him was Kitty Wynn as Helen. Helen begins the story outside Bobby's heroin world and is gradually pulled into it. The relationship becomes one of the ways the audience enters Needle Park. At first, she can still look at Bobby's life as something separate from her own. That difference does not last. The details of the film are fictional, but the world surrounding those characters came from years of reporting and observation. Cheap rooms, street dealing, people stealing to finance their use, small sellers trying to become larger sellers, police officers attempting to turn arrested users into informants. People moving between addiction, selling, prostitution, theft, hospitals, jail, and the park. The location itself remained recognizable. Before the title appears, the film tells the audience that Broadway and 72nd Street is officially Sherman Square, but is known to heroin addicts as Needle Park. Imagine what that meant for the neighborhood. For years, Needle Park had been partly a local secret. Not a very well-kept secret, certainly. Police knew. Residents knew. Users knew. Journalists were beginning to know. But the nickname still belonged primarily to people familiar with the Upper West Side drug scene. Then the film gives an audience an exact intersection. Broadway, 72nd Street, New York's West Side. You could find it. The place was no longer simply described, it was identified. By the time the movie was being completed, the real heroin crisis surrounding it had become much larger than the original life story. New York had entered the worst period of its post-war heroin epidemic. One historical analysis estimates that the heroin-era cohort in New York eventually involved about 200,000 people, although estimates of illegal drug use are necessarily uncertain. Another historical review describes the city as experiencing a major heroin epidemic from the late 1960s into the middle of the 1970s. The statistics getting public attention were severe. On June 17, 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered a special message to Congress on drug abuse. He singled out New York City to show how serious the situation had become. According to the figures presented in that message, fewer than 200 narcotics-related deaths had been recorded in the city in 1960. By 1970, the number was above 1,000. Nixon also stated that narcotics had become the leading single cause of death for New Yorkers between the ages of 15 and 35. That same day, Nixon publicly called drug abuse America's public enemy number one and announced a broad federal offensive involving treatment, prevention, enforcement, and efforts to disrupt international supply. He also established the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention by executive order. Less than a month later, on July 13th, the Panic in Needle Park opened in New York. The timing was remarkable. The film had been developed for years, so it was not created in response to Nixon's June announcement. But audiences encountered it at almost exactly the moment heroin had become a national political emergency. One month the president was talking about narcotics deaths. The next month moviegoers could buy a ticket and watch two young people destroy themselves with heroin on actual New York streets. The subject was no longer hidden anywhere. The film had already attracted attention before its American theatrical release. It screened as the United States entry at the 1971 Cannes Film Festival, where Kitty Wynn received the festival's Best Actress award. The film opened in New York in July and carried an R rating. Contemporary interest was strong enough that some churches later arranged screenings connected with discussions for students and teachers, treating the film not merely as entertainment, but as material for conversations about drug use. This was a major change in what Needle Park represented. In the 1950s, the name circulated among people who already knew the neighbourhood. In 1965, Life brought it into American homes. In 1966, Mills turned it into a book title. By 1971, it was appearing on movie marquees. The unofficial nickname of a tiny Manhattan traffic island had become a cultural reference, and that created a problem for the real place. Once a location becomes famous for something undesirable, the residents who live around it inherit the reputation. Someone could live several blocks from Sheridan Square, have nothing to do with heroin, and still hear outsiders talk about the Upper West Side as though the entire neighbourhood were Needle Park. A business owner could resent the name because customers associated it with drugs. A landlord trying to attract tenants could resent it. Parents could resent it. People who had lived there before the heroin market developed could resent seeing their neighbourhood reduced to images of needles and cheap hotel rooms. The people using heroin did not disappear because the photographs were published. The dealers did not disappear because a book came out. The police problem did not disappear because a film crew arrived. But the political cost of allowing the situation to remain visible increased. That distinction becomes important. A city government can tolerate a problem for years when the problem is treated as local. Once newspapers, magazines, television, books and movies make that problem part of the city's reputation, officials are under pressure to show that something is being done. New York was already under enormous strain around the beginning of the 1970s. Crime was a major public concern. The police department was facing revelations about corruption. The city was dealing with deteriorating housing, social conflict, economic pressure, and growing anxiety about public disorder. Heroin connected itself to nearly all of those subjects. It was discussed as a health problem, a crime problem, a youth problem, a neighbourhood problem, a policing problem, a poverty problem, a problem of international trafficking. Different people proposed different solutions. Some wanted more arrests. Some wanted longer sentences. Some wanted treatment. Some wanted methadone programs expanded. Some wanted dealers removed from particular neighbourhoods. Some wanted the international supply interrupted before heroin ever reached New York. Even the Nixon administration's 1971 message mixed enforcement with a substantial emphasis on treatment and rehabilitation, acknowledging that reducing supply could not solve the problem while demand remained. The people at Sherman Square experienced these policy arguments in practical ways. More police meant more surveillance. More arrests meant familiar faces disappeared. Treatment programs meant some users left the street and entered clinics. Supply disruptions could produce shortages. Shortages could produce panics. A political decision made in Washington, Albany, City Hall, Turkey, France, or inside a police headquarters could eventually change what happened around one small set of benches. That is one of the strangest things about Needle Park. The location was physically tiny, but its history connected to systems far larger than the park itself. International heroin routes ended there. Federal drug policy affected it. New York policing affected it. Housing conditions affected it. The subway made it accessible. Journalism made it famous. Cinema preserved its appearance. And people who had never seen Sherman Square began using the name as shorthand for urban heroin addiction. By then, there was no going back to the old anonymity. The park could not become unknown again. Even if every dealer left tomorrow, the nickname would remain. Even if the benches were replaced, people would remember what had happened on the old ones. Even if the neighbourhood improved, photographs and film would continue showing an earlier version. That is the strange bargain created when a place becomes historically famous for its worst years. The fame helps preserve the history. It also traps the place inside that history. For Sherman Square, the next stage was therefore not simply about stopping heroin sales. New York had to deal with a location whose physical appearance had become evidence of failure. The benches themselves now carried meaning. The cheap hotels carried meaning. The people standing around the subway entrance carried meaning. Residents no longer wanted to hear that enforcement was complicated or that addiction could not be solved by moving people from one corner to another. They wanted their corner back. And city officials were beginning to understand that one of the easiest things to change about a difficult social problem was not necessarily the problem itself. It was the place where everybody could see it. It was the place where everybody could see it. That made the obvious solution seem simple. If the problem was visible in Sherman Square and Verdi Square, then clear the squares, move the dealers, arrest the sellers, remove people sleeping on the benches, repair the landscaping, put ordinary residents back into the space. New York tried versions of all of those things. What it discovered was that getting rid of the name Needle Park was much easier than getting rid of heroin. There was no single raid that ended the park. No mayor stood at Broadway and 72nd Street one morning and announced that the problem had been solved. The transformation took decades, and for much of that period the results were incomplete. Police pressure changed the street market. Treatment programs removed some people from the cycle of buying heroin every day. Heroin use itself began changing after the enormous epidemic of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Residents pushed for cleaner public spaces. Property values changed. Buildings were renovated. The neighbourhood became wealthier. Eventually the subway station and the squares around it were physically redesigned. All of those things mattered. None of them worked alone. The first important point is that the release of the panic in Needle Park in 1971 did not immediately clean up the real Needle Park. If anything, the neighbourhood was entering one of the most difficult periods in New York's modern history. The citywide heroin epidemic was near its peak. Research tracking heroin use in New York found that the number of new intensive users began declining around 1970, but the existing population of people already dependent on heroin remained very large. The decline in new users did not mean the street suddenly emptied. People who had become addicted during the previous years were still using, still buying, still entering treatment, still being arrested, and still appearing in public drug markets. At the same time, New York was approaching its fiscal crisis. Municipal services were under pressure. Parks across the city suffered from declining maintenance. Between 1968 and 1975, the number of full-time employees in the Parks Department fell dramatically, and the 1975 fiscal crisis produced even deeper cuts. Public spaces elsewhere in Manhattan developed many of the same problems associated with Sherman Square: drug sales, sleeping on benches, vandalism, poor maintenance, and residents avoiding areas they no longer considered safe. So the city could not simply spend its way out of Needle Park in 1971. It barely had enough money to maintain the park system it already had. There were, however, small attempts to reclaim the space. In 1972, local teenagers repainted benches in Verdi Square and planted roughly 300 begonias. It was a modest project, especially when compared with the scale of the heroin problem surrounding the area, but it tells us something important about how neighbourhood residents were thinking. They did not necessarily see the square as permanently lost. Flowers and fresh paint could not stop heroin trafficking, but they could signal that somebody still considered the place worth maintaining. That kind of effort became common in New York during the 1970s and 1980s. Residents in struggling neighbourhoods cleaned lots, planted gardens, formed block associations, pressured landlords, and tried to restore public spaces at a time when city government often lacked the money to do everything itself. Research on urban greening in New York has linked these neighbourhood efforts to both recovery and later gentrification, including on the Upper West Side. Verdi Square also acquired an unusual form of protection. In 1975, the Landmarks Preservation Commission designated it one of New York City's early scenic landmarks. The scenic landmark category had only recently been added to the city's preservation system, and Verdi Square became one of the first public spaces protected under it. Consider the contradiction. The square could be officially recognised as historically and aesthetically important, while drug dealers and heroin users were still gathering nearby. A landmark designation does not remove a dealer. It does not cure addiction. It does not make a bench safe. But it changes the official understanding of a place. The city was saying that this little triangle was not disposable. It had a history before Needle Park, and it was supposed to have a future after it. The more significant change was happening away from the benches. New York was building a much larger system for treating heroin dependence. In 1966, New York State created the Narcotic Addiction Control Commission within the Department of Mental Hygiene. Its responsibilities included supervising addiction treatment centers and coordinating rehabilitation and prevention programs. The organization would later be renamed and reorganized, but its creation reflected a growing acceptance that narcotics addiction could not be handled entirely through police and prisons. Methadone changed the treatment landscape even more. Doctors Vincent Dole and Marie Niswander had begun experimental methadone maintenance work in New York during the early 1960s and published important findings in 1965. Their approach treated severe heroin dependence as a medical condition that could be stabilized with a long-acting opioid, rather than demanding that every patient immediately remain completely drug-free. The idea was controversial, but programs expanded rapidly. Nationwide, fewer than 400 patients were enrolled in methadone maintenance in 1968. By January 1973, federal and non-federal programs together were treating about 73,000 patients. New York became one of the centres of that expansion. The city's methadone program admitted large numbers of patients during the early 1970s. A later study of people admitted between November 1970 and the end of 1973 found that 67% remained continuously in treatment for at least 1 year and half remained for 2 years. Those numbers did not mean everyone stopped using heroin. Methadone programs had problems of their own. Some patients continued using other drugs. Methadone itself sometimes reached illegal markets. Programs varied in quality. Critics argued over whether maintenance represented treatment or simply another form of dependence. But for the history of Needle Park, the important thing is practical. A person receiving a stable daily dose through a treatment program did not necessarily need to spend every morning looking for a heroin seller on Broadway. Multiply that by thousands of people, and the street economy changes. Treatment did not empty the benches overnight. It reduced one of the forces keeping people there. Changes in heroin supply contributed as well. Historical reviews of methadone regulation note that several East Coast cities experienced periods of reduced heroin availability during the early 1970s as a result of enforcement activity and disruptions in supply. Again, reduced supply did not automatically solve the problem. Anyone who remembers what a panic meant in Needle Park knows why. Scarcity could make the street more desperate before it made the street quieter. Users searched farther, prices changed, substitutes appeared, people took greater risks. But over a longer period, heroin markets were changing. The generation that had entered heroin use during the great rise of the 1960s was aging, dying, entering treatment, going to prison, stopping drug use, or moving through the city. Research on New York's drug eras shows a decline in new heroin initiation after the early 1970s, even though heroin remained a serious problem. That distinction is important because public drug markets depend partly on renewal. A park can survive the disappearance of individual users if new ones continually replace them. If fewer new people enter the network, the social system becomes harder to sustain at the same level. But Needle Park did not simply vanish during the 1970s. In fact, if you had visited the area expecting the famous heroin market to be gone by 1975, you might have been disappointed. New York's financial crisis was weakening public services at exactly the time the city needed stronger maintenance and enforcement. Single-room occupancy hotels and other inexpensive accommodations remained part of the Upper West Side. People with addiction, mental illness, poverty and unstable housing continued living in and moving through the neighborhood. Drug dealing remained visible. The 1971 film had made the name Needle Park famous, but the reality survived the publicity. Even by the late 1980s, the reputation had not completely disappeared. A 1989 history of the Upper West Side described Verdi Square as still associated with open drug dealing and users nodding near the monument. A later neighbourhood account similarly recalled efforts during the 1980s to revive the park, rather than describing the problem as something that had ended years earlier. So if we are asking when New York erased Needle Park, the answer cannot be 1971, it cannot be 1975, it probably cannot even be 1980. The disappearance was gradual because the neighbourhood itself was changing. Between 1970 and 1980, the Upper West Side experienced major reinvestment. An academic study of the neighbourhood's revitalisation during that decade concluded that local and citywide institutions played an important role in transforming an ethnically and economically diverse area toward greater affluence. That process had started earlier. Lincoln Center and the urban renewal projects surrounding it had already changed the southern Upper West Side during the 1950s and 1960s. New residents were moving into older buildings. Preservation campaigns increased interest in historic architecture. Apartment houses that had been allowed to deteriorate began attracting investment again. During the 1980s, the change accelerated. Buildings were renovated, rents rose. More affluent residents arrived. Businesses serving those residents followed. The Upper West Side increasingly became desirable, not because it was cheap, but because its old apartment houses, proximity to Central Park and Riverside Park, subway access, cultural institutions, restaurants, and neighbourhood streets made it attractive to people with substantial incomes. A 1987 academic analysis specifically described the neighbourhood's revitalisation between 1970 and 1980 as involving increased homogeneity and affluence. Later histories of the Upper West Side similarly describe the wealth of the 1980s, bringing higher rents, new residents, and extensive renovation of the neighbourhood's older buildings. This changed Needle Park in a way police raids could not. It changed who lived around it. A public drug market has an easier time surviving, where there are cheap rooms, unstable buildings, poorly maintained public spaces, limited investment, and large numbers of people with few alternatives. As the surrounding real estate became more valuable, those conditions became harder to preserve. Landlords renovated buildings, some inexpensive rooms disappeared, businesses changed, new residents demanded more from police and city agencies, property owners had greater financial reasons to push against activity that frightened customers or reduced property values. The same Broadway location that had once made Needle Park convenient for heroin users now made it extremely valuable to developers and merchants. The 72nd Street subway station was an express stop in a neighborhood that was becoming more expensive every year. The forces competing for that intersection were no longer equal. One group had a street market. The other had rising property values, political organization, municipal attention, and millions of dollars in real estate investment. Over time, that matters. Still, gentrification should not be confused with treatment. If a person with heroin dependence could no longer afford a room near 72nd Street, the dependence did not disappear. If police moved dealers away from Sherman Square, heroin did not disappear from Manhattan. If a hotel was converted into expensive apartments, the former residents did not vanish. They went somewhere else. That is why saying New York cleaned up Needle Park can hide part of what happened. The city reclaimed a particular place. It did not necessarily solve every problem belonging to the people who had occupied that place. Some entered treatment, some recovered, some died, some went to jail, some moved into other neighborhoods, some continued using heroin elsewhere. The visible concentration at Broadway and 72nd Street diminished, and for the residents who wanted their public spaces back, that difference was enormous. The physical transformation eventually caught up with the social one. By the 1990s, the intersection was operating in a very different neighborhood from the one filmed by Jerry Schatzberg in 1970. Then came the subway reconstruction. The old 72nd Street station had always been awkward. Its original arrangement had narrow platforms, difficult circulation, and a single historic control house on the traffic island south of 72nd Street. A major modernization created a second station house north of 72nd Street, widened parts of the station, added a crossover, and made the station accessible. The project was completed in 2002. Above ground, the project changed Verdi Square as well. Traffic was reorganized, and part of the roadway was converted into pedestrian space. The landscape architects responsible for the project described creating approximately 17,000 square feet of plaza space and combining previously disconnected remnants of the traffic island into a more coherent public area. The design added clearer circulation, seating, landscaping and space for activities such as a farmer's market. This was almost the opposite of the old Needle Park arrangement. The old square had been useful partly because people could sit and wait without much supervision or purpose. The redesigned space was intended to attract many different kinds of legitimate activity: commuters, shoppers, residents, people buying food, people sitting in landscaped areas, people using the new subway entrance. A successful public space becomes harder for one small group to dominate when large numbers of other people have reasons to use it. The new station house also increased the daily presence of transit employees and brought additional institutional attention to a place that had once benefited from neglect. Verdi Square was reconstructed after the subway work, and landscape designer Lyndon Miller developed planting around the Verdi Monument in 2004. The monument itself had been restored. Flowers returned. The subway entrance was new. The surrounding buildings were increasingly expensive. The benches were no longer functioning as the headquarters of a famous heroin market, and the neighborhood had another use for its history. Music returned. By the 2000s, local organizations and the Parks Department were supporting outdoor performances in Verdi Square, deliberately reconnecting the location to the musicians who had once gathered around the Ansonia and the monument long before the Needle Park years. That is one way cities rewrite places. They do not have to demolish everything. They emphasize a different memory. Instead of heroin, Verdi. Instead of dealers, musicians. Instead of a cheap room nearby, expensive apartments. Instead of people waiting for a connection, commuters waiting for the train. Instead of a photograph of somebody nodding on a bench, flowers around a landmark. The physical intersection barely moved. Its meaning changed completely. By the first decade of the 21st century, articles about the area routinely described Needle Park in the past tense. A 2007 account of redevelopment around Verdi Square described the drug scene as part of the neighbourhood's notorious history and presented the surrounding gentrification as an accomplished transformation rather than a future possibility. That does not mean every social problem disappeared. Verdi Square continued to generate complaints about homelessness, mental illness, occasional drug activity, and other quality-of-life problems even after reconstruction. A neighbourhood report in 2013 documented residents complaining about exactly those issues. But nobody seriously confused that situation with the Needle Park of 1965. The system that had once made Sherman Square famous was gone. There was no large, stable heroin scene organised around those benches. There was no reason for a new generation of users to treat Broadway and 72nd Street as one of Manhattan's obvious places to score. The nickname survived mainly because of history, and because of the film. That might be the most successful part of the erasure. If you walk through the area without knowing the story, nothing tells you immediately what happened there. The subway station looks important. The Verdi monument looks established. The landscaping looks deliberate. People move through quickly. Restaurants and shops surround the intersection. The Ansonia still stands above Broadway. The location looks like what it had once been before the heroin years, a busy Upper West Side crossroads. A person could stand there for 20 minutes and never guess that American magazine readers once saw photographs from this area as evidence of an urban narcotics crisis, or that Al Pacino's first starring role helped make its unofficial name famous around the world. New York did not erase the film. It did not erase the photographs. It did not erase the people who remembered stepping around needles near the curb. What New York erased was the daily machinery that had made the nickname useful. The reliable gathering point, the familiar cellars, the cheap rooms, the repeated waiting, the expectation that someone searching for heroin should come here, the assumption among residents that certain benches belonged to the drug scene. Those things disappeared at different times and for different reasons. Treatment mattered. Changing heroin patterns mattered. Police mattered. Residents mattered. Investment mattered. Rising rents mattered. Preservation mattered. Subway reconstruction mattered. Redesigning the public space mattered. And gentrification mattered, with all the benefits and displacement contained in that word. By the time all of those forces had finished changing the intersection, Needle Park existed more clearly on film than it did on Broadway. But removing a drug market from one small park is not the same as removing the people who once depended on it, and it is not the same as ending heroin in New York. Once the benches no longer carried the old crowd, the harder question was what exactly had been removed from the city, what had simply moved somewhere else, and what remained in the lives of the people who had passed through Needle Park. What remained was harder to photograph. Once the dealers were no longer gathering openly around the same benches, once the subway entrances had been rebuilt, once the surrounding buildings had become more expensive, and the name Needle Park belonged increasingly to old newspaper articles and a 1971 movie, the change could look complete. Walk through Broadway and 72nd Street years later, and you might reasonably conclude that New York had solved whatever had happened there. That would be giving one intersection too much credit. The heroin market that made Sherman Square famous had disappeared as a recognisable public institution. The people who had participated in that market did not disappear together. Some stopped using heroin, some entered methadone treatment, some moved away, some went to prison, some continued using in other parts of the city, some aged into the next phase of New York's drug history, and some did not live long enough to see the Upper West Side become the expensive neighbourhood it would later become. This is one of the difficulties in following the history of a place like Needle Park. Buildings leave records, parks leave records, subway stations leave records, governments document renovations, arrests, budgets, treatment programs, and deaths. The people who spent 6 months sitting on a bench in 1967 usually did not. They appear briefly in photographs, police reports, hospital records, newspaper stories, court files, or the memories of someone who knew them. Then many disappear from the historical record. The larger population, however, can still be followed. New York's heroin epidemic did not end when the number of new users began declining in the early 1970s. Researchers studying heroin activity in the city found that the number of new intensive users started falling around 1970, but a very large population of existing users remained. Estimates based partly on New York's narcotics registry placed the number of narcotics users at about 165,000 in 1970 and around 200,000 by 1980, with heroin accounting for the overwhelming majority of people recorded during the registry years. That meant the generation associated with places like Needle Park was still there. They were simply getting older. A man who had started injecting heroin at 19 in 1966 was 33 in 1980. Someone who had been 25 when James Mills was reporting from Needle Park in 1965 was 40 when the 1980s began. That aging population carried decades of addiction, treatment, incarceration, medical problems, and exposure to street drugs into a period when New York was about to face another crisis. This one would make the danger of the needle itself much more serious. HIV appears to have entered New York City's population of people who injected drugs during the middle to late 1970s. At the time, nobody understood that a new virus was spreading through shared injection equipment. Heroin and cocaine were being injected, sterile syringes were difficult to obtain legally, and people sometimes used shooting galleries where injection equipment could pass between users. Researchers looking back at stored blood samples later concluded that HIV spread with extraordinary speed through these networks. The consequences were enormous. By the middle of the 1980s, studies estimated that HIV prevalence among New York injection drug users had exceeded 50%. A historical review of the city's AIDS epidemic described an existing population of roughly 200,000 heroin users who were suddenly at high risk from a bloodborne infection many had encountered before they even knew it existed. Think about what that means in relation to the world we have been following. The people at Needle Park already worried about weak heroin. They worried about strong heroin. They worried about withdrawal. They worried about arrests. They worried about money. They worried about who might be informing on whom. By the late 1970s, another danger was circulating through the same basic act of injection, and almost nobody understood it yet. A syringe could be used, passed to somebody else, rinsed poorly, and used again. The person sharing it might look healthy. The first person might look healthy. Years could pass before either understood what had happened. New York eventually became the site of the largest early HIV epidemic among people who injected drugs in the United States. Research from Beth Israel Medical Center describes the epidemic beginning among drug users in the mid-1970s, spreading rapidly and stabilizing at a prevalence above 50% for a period before prevention efforts helped drive it downward. Needle Park itself was no longer necessary for this to happen. That is an important change. The public market could be broken apart while the social networks created during the heroin years continued elsewhere. People did not need to be sitting around Sheridan Square to share drugs or injection equipment. They could meet in apartments, hotels, abandoned buildings, shooting galleries, other street markets, private rooms. The disappearance of the famous gathering place therefore made part of the heroin world less visible, without making its medical consequences less serious. And during the 1980s, the drug landscape changed again. Cocaine became increasingly important among people who were already injecting heroin. Researchers examining New York's early HIV epidemic found especially high infection rates among people injecting both heroin and cocaine. One study using samples collected between 1978 and 1983 found HIV antibodies in 52% of people who injected both drugs, compared with 13% among those in the study who injected heroin alone. Then crack cocaine arrived. By the middle of the 1980s, smokable cocaine was spreading through New York and other American cities. The social world of street drugs changed rapidly. Crack created new markets, new patterns of dealing, and new forms of public fear. Heroin remained, but it no longer monopolized the political imagination in the way it had during the Needle Park years. A history of New York's AIDS epidemic notes that crack was becoming available in several cities by the mid-1980s and created additional complications for communities already dealing with heroin, cocaine injection, HIV, and poverty. The drug changed. The neighborhood changed. The headlines changed. A familiar pattern remained. New York repeatedly found a particular block, park, housing project, or neighborhood where a much larger problem could be seen clearly, and then treated that location as though it were the problem itself. That had happened at Needle Park. It would happen elsewhere. Public drug markets are visible. Visibility produces complaints. Complaints produce police pressure. Police pressure can disrupt the market. Sometimes the market disappears from that location. What happens next is more complicated. Some people enter treatment, some reduce their drug use, some stop, some are incarcerated, some die, some simply begin buying somewhere else. This is why the history of Needle Park cannot be reduced to a story in which a dangerous square became a safe square. The reclamation of Sherman and Verdi squares was real. Residents benefited from cleaner public space, commuters benefited, businesses benefited. People who wanted to sit on a bench without being surrounded by an active heroin market benefited. None of that needs to be dismissed. But the success of a public space renovation and the success of drug policy are not the same measurement. New York itself gradually began acknowledging that distinction. During the period when Needle Park first became famous, the dominant public response to heroin had relied heavily on arrest, punishment, and forced separation from the street. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, methadone maintenance was expanding. By the AIDS era, another argument became unavoidable. If some people were going to continue injecting drugs, should the government make it easier for them to obtain sterile syringes? For many years, that idea was extremely controversial. Critics argued that distributing clean needles would encourage drug use. Supporters argued that people were already injecting, and that preventing HIV transmission could keep them alive long enough to enter treatment later. New York moved slowly. Activists established small syringe exchange efforts before the programs received full official support. In 1992, New York State began licensing and funding syringe exchanges with the cooperation of the city. The scale then increased dramatically. Researchers estimated that the number of syringes exchanged in New York City rose from around 250,000 in 1991 to 1.3 million in 1994, 2.4 million in 1996, and roughly 3 million annually by 2000. The results were significant. Studies found major declines in risky syringe sharing and in new HIV infections among people who injected drugs. Research reviewing the New York experience describes HIV incidents falling from roughly 4 infections per 100 person years to about 1 after the large-scale expansion of syringe exchange, with prevalence also declining substantially over time. That gives the name Needle Park an uncomfortable historical afterlife. In the 1960s, the needle was treated mainly as evidence. A needle meant addiction. A needle meant crime. A needle on the pavement meant the neighborhood had lost control. 30 years later, public health workers were deliberately handing sterile needles to people who used drugs because a clean syringe could prevent an HIV infection. The object had not changed. The policy around it had. That change did not mean New York suddenly became relaxed about heroin. Police enforcement continued. Drug possession and dealing remained criminal matters. Neighbourhood battles over public drug use continued. What changed was the recognition that keeping someone alive could be a legitimate goal even if that person had not yet stopped using drugs. Naloxone eventually became another part of that approach. Instead of waiting for every person to achieve abstinence, health workers, families, outreach programs, and eventually ordinary members of the public could carry a medication capable of reversing an opioid overdose. That response would have been almost unimaginable during Needle Park's early years. The old system often asked what punishment should follow drug use. The newer system also asked what would keep the person alive tonight. Not everyone agreed with the shift, and arguments about enforcement, treatment, public disorder, and harm reduction have continued ever since. But the medical history made one thing difficult to deny. Dead people do not enter recovery later. The Upper West Side, meanwhile, continued moving in the opposite economic direction, from the neighbourhood shown in the panic in Needle Park. Buildings that had contained cheap rooms became valuable real estate. Apartment renovations increased. The public spaces around Broadway and 72nd Street received more attention. Verde Square remained protected as a scenic landmark, a status it had received in 1975 and still held decades later. In 2024, New York's Landmarks Preservation Commission included Verde Square among the city's 12 designated scenic landmarks. That official identity is almost strange when placed beside the park's other identity, scenic landmark, Needle Park. Both names refer to the same small piece of Manhattan history. One name emphasizes the Verde monument, architecture, public space, and preservation. The other preserves the years when heroin dominated the square's reputation. Cities do this constantly. They layer reputations rather than completely replacing them. A person buying food near the square today does not erase someone who waited there for heroin in 1965. A renovated subway station does not erase the old benches. Flowers do not erase police surveillance. An expensive apartment does not erase the cheap room that may once have existed in the same building. But daily life favours the present. Most people crossing Broadway have somewhere to go. They look at the traffic signal. They check the subway entrance. They look at their phones. They meet somebody. They buy something. They move on. History usually becomes invisible again unless someone points to it. Film prevented Needle Park from becoming completely invisible. Jerry Schatzberg's 1971 movie did more than tell a fictional story about Bobby and Helen. Because it was filmed in the actual city, it preserved streets, interiors, clothing, storefronts, traffic, subway areas, and the physical environment of a New York that continued changing after the cameras left. The actors became older. The buildings were renovated, businesses closed, cars disappeared from the streets, the subway changed, but the film remained the same length. Every time someone watches it, Manhattan in 1970 reappears. This is one reason the cultural memory of Needle Park became larger than the physical park itself. There are New Yorkers who know the name entirely because of the movie. Some know it because of Al Pacino, some know it through James Mills, some know it through Bill Epridge's photographs. Some remember the real intersection, and those memories do not always describe exactly the same place. The film is not a documentary. The novel is not a complete census of everyone who used the park. The life story concentrated on a few lives. Long-time residents remember different years and different blocks. Police saw one version. Users saw another. Shopkeepers saw another. That is normal. Historical places are often remembered through whoever had the means to record them. The people photographed tend to become representative of people who were never photographed. That makes it worth being careful about what Needle Park represents. It was never every heroin user in New York. It was never every resident of the Upper West Side. It was never the entire story of addiction in the 1960s. It was one unusually visible location inside a much larger epidemic. And if we treat the disappearance of that location as the end of the story, we miss what happened next. New York continued having an opioid problem. The substances changed. The purity changed, the routes of administration changed, treatment changed, public health policy changed. Prescription opioids eventually became part of the national crisis. Then illicitly manufactured fentanyl altered the drug supply again. By the 2010s and 2020s, the main opioid danger facing New Yorkers looked very different from the street heroin sold around Needle Park. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid far more potent than heroin, and New York City health officials now describe illicit fentanyl as common in the unregulated drug supply. It can appear in substances sold as heroin and in other drugs, meaning people may consume it without realizing exactly what they have purchased. The overdose numbers eventually exceeded those that had caused alarm during the original heroin crisis. New York City recorded 3,056 overdose deaths in 2023. Fentanyl was present in about 80% of them. Provisional city data later showed a substantial decline in 2024 to 2,192 overdose deaths, a 28% reduction from the previous year, although major racial and geographic inequalities remained. Those numbers should stop us from saying that New York defeated the problem represented by Needle Park. It defeated Needle Park as a place. That is different. There is no longer a famous heroin market operating from those same benches. But New Yorkers still become dependent on opioids. People still overdose, families still lose relatives, dealers still adapt to enforcement, drug supplies still change without users necessarily knowing what is in them, treatment still has gaps, police and public health officials still argue about the correct balance between enforcement, treatment, harm reduction, and public order. The questions asked around Needle Park did not disappear. They changed vocabulary. Is addiction a crime, a medical condition, a social problem, a neighborhood problem? When does helping a person become enabling? When does enforcing public order simply move the problem? How much should the city tolerate in a public space? What does a neighborhood owe the person using drugs? What does the person using drugs owe the neighborhood? New York has been arguing over versions of those questions for more than half a century. The answers have changed because the consequences taught the city things it did not understand in the 1950s. One of the clearest lessons came from HIV. New York learned, at enormous human cost, that making sterile injection equipment difficult to obtain did not necessarily stop injection. It could make injection more dangerous. The city learned that treatment could reduce the need for a person to organize every waking hour around street heroin. It learned that people who continued using drugs could still change their behavior to reduce disease transmission. It learned that syringe exchange could operate on a large scale without producing the disaster opponents had predicted. And it learned that epidemics among marginalized people do not remain isolated simply because the rest of the city would prefer not to look at them. The same invisibility that allowed Needle Park to exist for years before national magazines became interested in it also shaped the early AIDS epidemic. Problems become easier to ignore when the people most affected have little political power. By the time everyone notices, the problem may already be much larger. That may be the most useful reason to remember Needle Park now, not because the park was uniquely evil, not because New York in the 1960s was uniquely broken, and not because the people sitting on those benches deserve to be remembered only for the worst period of their lives. The place is useful because it shows how a city turns a complicated human problem into geography. Needle Park gave heroin an address. Once heroin had an address, reporters could visit it, police could patrol it, residents could complain about it, politicians could promise to clean it up, filmmakers could photograph it, and eventually the city could redesign it. The address could be changed. The larger problem required something else. If you stand near Broadway and 72nd Street now, you can still understand why the location attracted people in the first place. The subway is still important. The intersection is still busy. People still meet there. Someone still waits for someone who is late. Someone still sits because they are tired. A person comes out of the station and looks around for a familiar face. That basic urban function has survived every version of the square. What changed was the reason one particular group had for gathering there. For roughly 2 decades, heroin made that reason powerful enough to give the place a second name. Then the social network weakened, the neighborhood changed, the city changed its approach to addiction, and the physical environment was rebuilt around another kind of public life. The nickname remained. That is why Needle Park can feel larger in memory than it ever was in reality. It was never a large park. It was never a remote district. It was a small set of public spaces at an extremely busy Manhattan intersection. That smallness was exactly what made it important. Everything was close enough to see. The commuter and the dealer, the resident and the user, the detective and the informant, the expensive apartment and the cheap hotel room, the Verdi monument and the heroin sale. New York usually allows people to avoid the parts of the city they do not want to think about. Needle Park made avoidance difficult. For a while, the problem sat directly beside the subway entrance. Then New York removed the visible scene, rebuilt the space, and moved forward. The historical record stayed behind. A magazine spread from 1965, a novel from 1966, a film released in 1971, government reports, medical studies, photographs of young people who expected to wake up the next morning and continue searching. Those records are what allow us to look at the renovated intersection and understand that the calm appearance of a place tells us almost nothing about everything that has happened there. And tomorrow morning, thousands of people will come through 72nd Street again. Most will never call it Needle Park. They have no reason to. For them, it is simply part of the Upper West Side, a subway stop, a meeting place, a few benches, which is very close to what it was before the Needles arrived.